Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Secrets on the Prairie by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. I'm sorry, Grace, but there's a problem, the petite young woman said sheepishly. Grace closed her eyes and shook her head. Why had she been so foolish? Just 5 minutes ago, she was composing herself on the train, ready to meet the man with whom she would spend the rest of her life. But now, there was a problem. Deep down, she always knew that there would be. It had taken 6 days for Grace Thornton to reach Billings, Montana. With each passing mile, the excitement and tension grew in her stomach. As she traveled west from New York City, the landscape changed remarkably almost by the hour. When she first saw the mighty Yellowstone River, she knew that her final destination was close. She took a few moments to ensure that her appearance was acceptable. After almost a week of train travel, Grace knew she had looked better. But she made the best of a bad situation. She wanted Brody's first impression of her to be favorable. There is only ever one chance to make a first impression, her mother had always told her. And this was it. Grace felt the train begin to break, just like it had done numerous times on the journey so far. The train's whistle pierced the silence. She was here. She closed her eyes and said a silent prayer. She began saying farewell to her traveling companions. There were just 3 of them, all moving on to different destinations and with different futures ahead of them. Everyone wished her well, and she echoed the sentiments in return. Finally, the train came to a halt, and Grace carefully opened the door and climbed down. Percival Settle, one of those traveling companions, was an elderly lawyer. At least he claimed to be a lawyer. Grace had some doubts, considering the stories he told on the journey. He passed her down her small suitcase and carpetbag. She thanked him and took her first steps out onto the platform and her new future. The platform seemed to be a hastily constructed structure. The wooden planks appeared to bow when she took a few steps forward. She glanced down, rather fearful that they would snap. But despite a few creaks, they held firm. She looked up and down the platform. She had rather expected it to be busier than it was. One man had disembarked from the train further down, and, by all appearances, he had no luggage, just his hat. He marched off past her, giving her a curt nod of his head as he went. "Ma'am?" She simply smiled in response. Billings train station was nothing like Grand Union in New York City. That was a huge architectural wonder, made of red brick and built to last a lifetime. This place seemed to have been knocked up in a matter of days. There was a small wooden hut that she presumed served as a ticket office, but even that seemed unmanned. Brody was meant to be here to meet her. He promised that that would be the case in his letters. But there was no sign of him at all. Behind the station, the town of Billings stood proudly on the frontier. She could hear dogs barking, the occasional horse neighing, and the sound of a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. The town looked pretty much as she expected. A cluster of wooden buildings assembled closely together with a swarm of tents pitched between the station and the town. Construction could clearly not keep up with the number of inhabitants. Maybe Brody had been delayed, she thought, looking anxiously up and down. The trains could easily be delayed. They had mercifully had an easy journey, at least according to Percival. There were no blockages on the line, no breakdowns, and, most thankfully of all, no bandits. Brody said his ranch was some 3 hours from Billings. He could well have been experiencing a delay on the journey. She had no doubts he would be here. His letters were diligent, and they were numerous. He seemed desperate for her to arrive. Prosody rate pursement, which made it all the stranger that he wasn't there to greet her. The only other figure to be seen was that of a young woman further up the platform. She wasn't sure, but she got the impression that she had emerged from one of the front carriages of the train. Probably also a mail-order bride, traveling west on little more than a hope and a prayer. She didn't seem to have a man waiting for her either. Grace decided to walk toward her. Maybe the two could wait for their expected men together. As she approached the young woman, she could tell that she was small and slightly built. She was dressed, not in a dress that would have been suitable in New York City, but more practically suited to the frontier. Despite this, Grace could see that she was a pretty young girl. She guessed her to be in her early 20s. No doubt her intended husband would be delighted to see her. Grace, of course, was slightly older, at almost 30. She was sure she had more worldly experience, seeing as she had been married before and was now a widow. But despite all that, her sister assured her she was still a beautiful woman. She hoped that when Brody arrived, he would think so too. To her surprise, when she approached the young woman, she started to walk towards her too. It was at that point she realized that the pretty young girl had no luggage with her. Had she really traveled all the way from New York City with nothing? She knew that in some cases, mail-order brides were desperate to escape, but to leave with nothing seemed extreme. Grace was about to introduce herself, but the young woman spoke first. "Good morning. Are you Grace? Grace Thornton?" the woman asked in a shy, quiet voice. Grace was shocked. She did not expect the young woman to address her directly or know her name. "Yes, I am," she replied. 1,000 thoughts went through her mind in an instant, not many among them good. "I'm Emily, Brody's sister," the young woman explained, looking her directly in the eye for the first time. Grace knew all about Emily. Brody had talked about her a great deal in his letters. Since the death of their parents, Brody had taken on responsibility for her. Her green eyes were spectacular, and her long brown hair thick. Grace was surprised that she was not already married, especially considering the shortage of suitable women out on the frontiers. Relief suddenly flooded her. Brody hadn't abandoned her after all. No doubt he had business in the town or such like, and he would be here shortly. "Pleased to meet you, Emily," Grace said, not sure whether to shake her hand or offer a reassuring hug. She decided on neither, led by the more than apparent nervousness in the young woman. Emily began to look somewhat guilty. "Emily? What is it?" Grace pressed, suddenly feeling fear hit her stomach. "I'm sorry, Grace, but there's a problem." Chapter 2, 6 days earlier, New York City. "Do you really think this is a good idea, Grace?" Kate Thornton inquired as she put her coffee mug on the rickety table. The mug had a chip on the rim, but so did Grace's. It didn't matter, they could both still be used. Grace smiled at her younger sister in the most reassuring way she could summon. "Come on, we've been through this." "I know, but what if this man, this Brody, isn't what he seems?" Kate pressed softly. She glanced over towards the small bed in the corner of the tenement apartment. The little boy lay there, still sound asleep. Kate didn't want to disturb him, not now, so she kept her voice low. "It'll all be completely fine." "You've read the letters," Grace argued. She smiled and tried to sound confident, but inside she had the same nagging concerns. Anybody could be anything in letters, as Grace knew all too well. But what if it turns out he's a 50-year-old man? Or a 17-year-old boy? Or a confidence trickster? Or a criminal? Or worse? Kate blurted. Grace didn't know what could be worse than a criminal, but didn't want to correct her sister. "Look, Kate, it'll all be absolutely fine. Hundreds, if not thousands of women have done this. You've read the stories in the newspapers like I have. The vast majority of them have wonderful lives." "But what about those that don't?" Kate said, her words hanging heavy in the air. The two sisters had read numerous stories of mail-order brides heading west. They'd been amazed by the stories they'd read in newspapers and the images they'd seen. It was what had given Grace the idea in the first place. Life in this shabby tenement apartment in 5 Points, New York, with its daily grind, held no future for any of them. The frontier would offer them new hope. "As soon as I'm settled, I'll send for you both," Grace insisted. It was a phrase she had used many times over the last 3 or 4 months. She had believed that her sister was on board with the plan, but now, with the train about to leave in less than 2 hours, she seemed to be having doubts. "What if Brody doesn't want us there?" Kate said, looking over at the sleeping boy. "It's a ranch. It's huge. There's acres and acres of space. There are going to be hundreds of jobs that need to be done on that ranch. An extra pair of hands, I'm sure. Will be welcome. It has 20 or more ranch hands and workers. My guess is many of them will be looking for wives, Grace said, knowingly eyeing her sister. Kate gave out a deep sigh and nodded her head. But if it doesn't work out, you'll return. Of course, I'm not going to abandon you just yet. The two sisters stared at each other in silence before Grace finally pushed her chair away. I'm going to go. She stood up, and Kate could immediately feel the tears welling in her eyes. None of that, Grace scolded. Young know I'm not big on long goodbyes. I'll write to you as soon as I'm there, and as soon as I'm settled, in a matter of months you'll be there to join me. Both of you. Kate didn't say a word. She thought that if she did, a frog would catch in her throat and she would break down. She wanted to be brave for her elder sister. Grace was doing an amazing thing. She was doing it for them both and for young Mickey asleep in the corner. Grace turned, picked up her carpet bag, and very softly walked over towards the child in the corner. He looked so peaceful lying there asleep. She smiled. She was glad that he was still asleep. She would let Kate explain why she'd gone. She turned, blew a kiss to her sister, picked up the suitcase that was already by the door, and left. When the door closed behind her, Kate slumped back into the chair by the kitchen table, put her head in her hands, and cried. She wondered if she would ever see her sister again. Chapter 3. Grace stood opposing the Grand Union train depot, a huge, imposing building. Two gentlemen with southern accents and wearing suits stood next to her, telling each other it was a marvel of architecture. She didn't care about that. It was now her gateway to a better future for herself and her family. Her legs almost gave way when she walked down the stairs of the tenement building for what she prayed was the final time. She hated leaving them both, but she knew they all needed a future, and Grace believed that future lay out west. The hands of the huge clock on the building approached 5 to 8 in the morning. In a little over an hour, the train would depart for Billings, Montana. It would be a long and arduous journey, 5 or 6 days if she was lucky. Billings was her ultimate destination, but this train wouldn't take her the full journey. Firstly, she was heading to Chicago, where she would switch to the Milwaukee Railroad. Then in St. Paul, she would change again to the Northern Pacific Railroad. She knew perfectly well that these trains often encountered all manner of problems. The one she feared more than anything, of course, was bandits. She didn't have anything valuable worth stealing, but the thought of it still made her anxious. All sorts of unsavory thoughts floated around her mind. She almost turned back twice on the walk to the station. Despite her resolute appearance, she was fearful and knew she would miss her family dreadfully. She worried about Kate, now alone, and how she would struggle even more for money. They had saved diligently over the past 10 months to ensure this scheme would come to life. They put money aside, and now Kate could cover the living costs for up to 6 months. That was, of course, as long as the villainous landlord didn't raise the rent any further, or provided they weren't struck by a terribly cold winter that would have Kate purchase more fuel, or any other problems that might arise. She hoped little Mickey would be okay. She didn't want to think too much about it, knowing it would only make her upset again. Before long, he would be playing in the fresh Montana air, away from the illness, disease, and crime that plagued 5 Points. She took a final look up at the clock and walked inside the station. Her ticket had already been purchased, so she headed directly for the platform. As expected, the train was there, ready to leave, so she was able to board. Despite carrying a carpet bag and a suitcase, she walked elegantly along the platform. As she passed, she sensed gentlemen's heads turn to watch her. She guessed it was still unusual for a young woman to be traveling alone out west on the trains. She also knew perfectly well that all would assume that she was almost certainly heading west to become a mail-order bride. Most of them would wonder about her personal circumstances and what was causing her to flee to the west. Women endured this journey for a variety of reasons. Grace was now a widow. After 7 blissful years of marriage, illness struck and swept through the tenement block like wildfire. It seemed strange to her that out of the entire family, it was her strong and healthy husband, Peter, who didn't survive. Unexpected widowhood was something that happened to a good many women in 5 Points every winter. Grace was not unique. A woman needed a husband. She was still relatively young, not yet 30 years of age, and had no desire to live the rest of her life alone. Also, she had no desire to stay in New York City, filled as it was with ghosts and unhappy memories. When she first read a story about a mail-order bride heading to the West to marry a man she had never met, she was shocked. But then she began to research the idea a little more, and suddenly, the idea appealed to her. What other possible way would there be for her to escape the city? So she purchased a copy of the Matrimonial Times and scoured the advertisements. She kept it secret from Kate, of course, knowing she would immediately frown on the idea. The advertisement posted by Brody Hayes from Montana was the one that stood out to her. Even to this day, she couldn't explain why. It just did. And she wrote that first letter to Brody without breathing a word of it to anyone. When Brody replied, Grace knew there wasn't much chance she could keep it a secret. The correspondence volleyed back and forth. The plan grew in Grace's mind. Marry Brody and then send for Kate and Mickey. There would surely be room on a ranch that was probably hundreds of acres in extent. She couldn't even imagine what a single acre looked like, having been raised in the city. She imagined standing on a plain, looking as far as the eye could see, her view only interrupted by mountains and rivers. She climbed into an empty carriage and stowed her luggage carefully away. 6 days was a long time to travel. She hoped in equal measure for a peaceful journey and suitable traveling companions. She certainly hoped for female company. Just in case, she had a packed knife in her carpet bag. She stood up, grabbed the bag, and decided to put it next to her so the knife could be easily accessed. She didn't think she would need to use it. The trains carried guards to prevent bandit attacks, but they also served the useful purpose of protecting the passengers from one another. As time ticked on and Grace began to think she would be traveling alone, another young woman appeared suddenly on the platform. She looked up at the almost empty compartment, saw Grace sitting there, and smiled. "May I join you? I'm a little apprehensive about the journey." "Of course," Grace said, rising from her seat. The young woman climbed aboard. "My name is Anne. I'm going to be a mail-order bride in Tacoma. I have to say I'm rather nervous about it all." "I'm Grace. I am a mail-order bride, and I have to admit to being nervous too." Chapter 4. 6 days later, Billings, Montana. "What do you mean there's a problem, Emily? Is something wrong with Brody? Is he ill?" Grace asked. Being a rancher was obviously dangerous. Any number of catastrophes could have befallen him. Emily swallowed deeply. "No, Brody is absolutely fine, Grace." She stopped speaking as though she didn't want to speak about the issue out loud. Finally, she seemed to gather herself. "The problem is, he doesn't know that you're coming." Grace shook her head. "What do you mean? Didn't he get the last letter that explained the arrangements?" Grace realized that might make no sense. If the letter had not arrived at the ranch, how on earth could Emily know she would be on this train at this particular time? The letter must have arrived. "Look, you've had a long journey. Why don't we start heading to the ranch?" Emily said, biting her bottom lip. Grace decided this entire situation was absolutely ridiculous. Grace planted her carpet bag and suitcase on the platform, to which the boards creaked once more in protest, and she placed her hands on her hips. "No, Emily, I'm going nowhere until you explain what this problem is. I don't mean to be rude, but..." Grace didn't need to finish the sentence. It was obvious she needed a full explanation. "It was I who wrote the letters, Grace, not Brody. It was me who placed the advertisement in the first place." "Oh," Grace said, her heart sinking as the reality of the situation suddenly hit home. She felt like slumping to her knees in defeat. The train whistled unexpectedly, and the engine emitted a loud noise. With a mighty squeak, the brakes were released, and it began to roll forward. At the window, her new friend Anne gave her a confused-looking wave. She must have been wondering where Brody was. Grace glanced at her and offered an awkward nod. She hoped the young woman would have better luck when the train made it over the border to Washington Territory. "I just don't understand," Grace began. Once more, she shook her head, realizing she'd been deceived. All those months, all those letters, they weren't written by Brody at all, but by his sister. Kate once commented that it was a fine, elegant script, most unlike the handwriting that might be associated with a rugged frontiersman. Grace had thought nothing about it at the time, but how right she had been. "I'm sorry about all of this. I had meant to tell him and make it right before you arrived. But we've had 2 cattle drives come through. He was ensuring that none of our herd got mixed up with their steers. We've only just recovered from the winter, and we couldn't afford another disaster." Then he disappeared with the final cattle drive to pass through our land. He wanted to ensure that they made it off our land safely. He didn't entirely trust the Texan. The words Emily spoke might as well have been in French for all Grace understood. She had no idea what the young woman was talking about. She knew that moving to a ranch in Montana would be somewhat different from life in New York, but it seemed to encompass an entirely new language. "So what happens to me now then? I guess I'm heading back to New York. I'll need money and a place to stay until the next train. But I'm not at fault here," Grace said firmly. She did not have the funds to pay for a room or a ticket back home. As she thought of home, a pang of disappointment hit her. She wanted her new home to be here so that her family could have a brighter future. Those dreams had been shattered in just minutes. "Look, I know this isn't the best of starts. I know it is going to take something for you to trust me, but please listen." Emily reached up and grasped Grace's shoulders. She gave her the same sort of look that Kate regularly gave her. It was a pleading look that begged attention. Grace offered a small nod to signify her consent to listen. "Thank you. Even though Brody has no idea you're coming, I just know he will adore you. You're beautiful and, if you are anything like your letters, you're kind and honest." Emily's words were surprisingly stinging despite the praise. "Brody needs a wife. He works too hard. My mother, bless her soul, wanted him married off before she died. But Brody was always too busy, always trying to expand the ranch to meet father's expectations. He kept promising me he would put an advertisement out for a mail-order bride. When he didn't, I took the matter into my own hands," Emily explained. "So you're suggesting I come to the ranch with you, even though I'm not expected? Well, we're certainly not about to leave you here all alone. We'll get back to the ranch. It is a 4.5-hour ride away. I doubt Brody will be back. As I said, he disappeared with the final cattle drive. I'll explain everything to him when he comes back. Now that you're here, I just know he's going to fall in love with you." Grace had no idea what to do. After months of planning and then traveling for 6 long days to get here, it was to discover that the man with whom she had been corresponding had no idea she was coming. He hadn't written the letters at all. Those letters, the ones she had practically fallen in love with, despite her guilt at betraying her dead husband. It had all been deceit. She studied Emily for a moment. She could see the girl's expression was that of remorse and fear. Her face seemed to change as she looked at her, and it turned into Kate's face, and Grace could almost see Mickey at the young woman's side. This was why she was doing this. She was doing it for her family, to give them all a better life. Even if this rancher wasn't expecting her, there was still a chance. And if there was a chance of making a home here, she had to grasp it. "What about what you said in the letters? About Brody, his nature, his age, and the ranch? Is it as you described?" "How I described Brody? I think so. I'm a little biased because he's my elder brother. But yes, he's hardworking, he's God-fearing, and he's kind." She paused for a moment. "The women of the town think he is very handsome. The ranch is just as I explained. There is a large extent of land and a lot of steers." Grace took a deep breath. She closed her eyes and thought for a moment as she heard the sounds of the train disappearing into the distance. It seemed she had little choice. She would go to the ranch and try to charm Brody Hayes. Chapter 5. 8 months earlier, New York City. Every bone in Grace's body seemed to ache. It was always the case after she'd finished a shift at the clothing factory. She climbed the stairs of the tenement building. Something smelled bad somewhere, and she dreaded to think what on earth it might be. She was keen to get inside today, as she had some excitement to enjoy in what was usually a very mundane life. but her heart sank when she reached the top of the stairs, seeing a short, shadowed figure loitering outside her door. "Oh, hello, Grace," a thin and almost high-pitched voice said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Crook," Grace said. "Rent isn't due until next week, is it?" Crook was their landlord, a short man barely 5'2". She guessed he was around 40 years of age, but he could well have been older. He had a straggly, thin gray beard and bald, greasy hair. He had a pot-belly stomach, but always wore fine quality suits befitting a man of his means. The man made her skin crawl. "Yes, it is about the rent that I'm here, Grace. Times are hard at the moment. The rent needs to increase by $1 a week starting next month," he said almost apologetically. However, Grace knew there was absolutely no inch of remorse in his demand whatsoever. She could practically see him wringing his hands together with joy at the prospect of an extra $52 a year. "An increase? Have you seen the state of the room, Mr. Crook? The window? You promised to repair it." Grace almost regretted the words as soon as they came out of her mouth. "I'm happy to step inside now if you wish. I'll have a look at it. Maybe we could talk about the rent." He cocked his head inquiringly. Grace could see the sly look in his eyes. She paused for a moment and watched his eyes trail up and down her body. "Or I could always come back when your pretty little sister is home? Maybe she could show me?" "It doesn't matter about the window, Mr. Crook. $1 a week extra. We understand. The rent will be paid as normal next week," Grace said firmly, indicating she had no intention of allowing Crook anywhere near her or her sister. "Well, if you're sure, Grace, and if you struggle with the rent, as I've said before, arrangements can be made in certain ways," Crook said. "I must get on, Mr. Crook," Grace said, walking past him. She put the key in the lock and turned it. It gave a satisfactory clink. She walked into the apartment and turned around. Crook was still standing there, looking at her hopefully. She simply shut the door and ensured that she locked it behind her, keeping the key in the lock. Crook was a vile rogue. The women of the tenements all shared stories of his lecherous ways. Some of the women took him up on his offers, reducing rents in exchange for other things. Just the thought sent a shudder down Grace's spine. But women must do what they must to survive in 5 Points. She knew very well that Kate would be out. Around this time of the day, she took Mickey out to Central Park so he might have a little run in the fresh air under the afternoon sun. She would stop off and purchase food from the market, which was a 2-mile walk from home. She would always do it late in the day, hoping to grab some bargains on the produce that the traders hadn't been able to sell. Later, she would go to work. She helped out a woman in the tenement building who darned clothing. It brought a few extra dollars into the coffers. Grace put in long shifts at the clothing factory, and Kate worked in the building, which allowed both to look after Mickey. Usually, Grace would come in from the factory and want nothing more than to slump down in a chair and rest. She would be entertained by Mickey's antics for a while. He was such a fun-loving boy, and he was sweet and kind. But today she had stopped off at the post office on the way home. There was mail waiting for her. She had a second letter from Montana. Just last month, she had replied to an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. Brody Hayes required a wife. He owned a ranch in Montana and was looking for somebody to spend the rest of his life with and hopefully to bring up a family. He too was a widower, but now he was 35 and he was tired of being alone. She wrote that first letter with absolutely no expectation that Brody would respond. Most men were looking for young women in their early 20s, not necessarily a woman in her late 20s who had also been married before. But there was something in her heart that told her to give it a try. So she wrote her first letter. Something told her that Brody was going to be her future, and that Montana would be the place for her entire family to move to. She wrote the first letter and ripped it up. No man would want the woman she described, not even an older widower who might just understand. She thought deeply and constructed a missive that painted a more idealized picture of herself. There were no lies in it, of course. It just didn't paint the entire picture. She ended up drafting her reply 3 times before being satisfied. To her surprise, Brody responded. He seemed to write plainly, as you would expect from a rancher in Montana. But there was a warmth about his words that made her picture the kind of man he was in her heart. So she wrote another letter, telling him more about herself and her desire to escape 5 Points. She made no mention of her grand plans or her family, of course. That would have to come later. Grace listened at the door and heard Crook walk down the stairs. She sat at the table and opened the envelope she had collected from the post office. She pulled out the neatly folded letter. Dear Grace, I trust my letter finds you as well as is possible. I've never visited the city myself, but you paint a bleak picture. I understand your desire for a new way of life. Montana sounds about as different as it possibly could be from New York City. My ranch stands on acres of land. The mountains rise in the distance, and we have rivers running through the property. Among my favorite time of the day is the evening. I sit on the porch, drink coffee, and watch the sun go down. I live a simple life, but it's a good one. I just need someone to share it with again, other than my sister, of course. I didn't write much about Emily in the first letter, but she lives with me on the property. She is 23 years of age and a practical, down-to-earth sort of woman. Since the death of our parents, I have taken responsibility for her, as you would expect. There will always be a home for her here at the ranch. I thank you for your description of yourself. You sound like a beautiful woman. I am sorry about the loss of your husband. I too understand such loss. I married at 19. We were together less than a year before she was taken from me. Up until this point, I could not bear to consider marrying again. But now the time is right as long as the right woman can be found. You asked about a description of myself. I believe I'm tall, standing at a little over 6 feet. I have blue eyes, clean-shaven. My sister says I am fair-looking, but I'm not one to be a judge of that. I urge you to write again. I would like to get to know you better. Yours in expectation, Brody Hayes. It was a simple enough letter, but Grace seemed drawn to Brody in some way. Her heart ached for him, marrying so young and having it snatched away from him. She at least had enjoyed a number of blissful years with Peter. She couldn't imagine losing it all after a matter of months. She guessed she probably had a little less than half an hour before Kate returned with Mickey. She found herself a blank sheet of paper and began constructing a reply. Chapter 6. 8 months later, Billings, Montana, Grace sat on the cart as it moved in the direction of the Hayes Ranch. She didn't know whether to be angry, sad, or hopeful. She had just witnessed a rather uncomfortable conversation between Emily and a man she introduced as Jack. She guessed he was in his early 40s, wiry and weathered from years of outside work. He tipped his hat when he greeted her. "Ma'am, I'm Jack. Jack Bruce." Jack is the head ranch hand. He helps Brody keep it all ticking over, Emily explained. Jack offered Grace a sympathetic smile. "Could I have a word, Miss Emily?" They moved a short distance away. "He's going to go mad, Emily," Jack said, dropping his voice. Grace could clearly hear every single word he said, although she pretended not to notice. "This is exactly what he needs, Jack, and you know it. I need your support. You've got to encourage him." Emily smiled up at Jack, and Grace noticed the man soften. "I'll do what I can," he said. The pair shared a long and lingering look. Grace noticed how he referred to her not as Miss Emily, but as Emily when the two were conversing alone. A woman could tell instantly that the two were attracted to each other. She guessed they had been for some time. There was a natural comfort between the pair. She wondered if Brody knew that his head ranch hand was in love with his younger sister. That was quite an age gap, but what did that matter when love wove its magic spell? They rode in an uneasy silence for about 10 minutes, never truly entering the settlement of Billings. They passed a few shacks and tents pitched on the outskirts, but did not venture into the center. As they moved on, Grace couldn't help but be awed by the landscape. She had seen it all from the windows of the train, of course, but there was something different about being out here in the wilderness. There was a purity to the air that simply did not exist in New York City. She knew she could be happy here. She knew that this would be an excellent place for her sister and little Mickey to live the rest of their lives. She shook off the disappointment of the last hour and stiffened her resolve. Finally, Grace glanced at Emily. "Why did you do it, Emily? Why did you place the advertisement on your brother's behalf?" Emily sighed. Because I want him to be happy. He's not, but it's time for him. I can't allow him to let life pass him by. What if he doesn't want a wife? Grace asked. He does. He just thinks he's betraying Sarah by moving on. Grace knew all about Sarah. She had been Brody's wife. Brody, or rather Emily, had written in the letters that he had met Sarah when she accompanied her parents from Chicago to Billings on a wagon train. It had been a whirlwind romance, and they married soon after. Then, just like Peter, she succumbed to illness during one of the harsh Montana winters. I know that's something you can relate to, Emily said, placing a reassuring hand on Grace's knee. I'm sorry about your husband, about Peter. Thank you, Grace said, once more feeling the pang of guilt in her stomach. I agree it isn't easy to move on. How do you suppose Brody is going to react? He'll be shocked, I'll grant you that. But he needs this. He needs you. From your letters, I just know you'll be a wonderful match. You're just perfect. Despite the lies and deceit, Grace couldn't help but warm to Emily. She seemed to have a wise head on her shoulders for someone so young. She was doing what she thought was best for her family, very much like Grace was attempting for her own family. She couldn't blame the woman for that. Grace had spent those few silent minutes in thought. Had much changed? Admittedly, Grace had half fallen in love with Brody through his letters, and she thought Brody had done the same. But she knew that when she arrived, she would still have to gain his trust and respect and allow him to fall in love with her fully. The situation was still the same. I feel you have so many shared experiences, Emily continued. Brody never had a child with Sarah, and I know he desires a son, somebody to take over the ranch after he's gone. The fact you said you would like to start a family will suit Brody down to the ground. It's a blessing that neither of you had children. You can start fresh together. Grace swallowed hard and nodded. Children would indeed be a blessing. She turned and pretended to look at the landscape, and as she did so, she wiped a single tear from her cheek. Chapter 7. Jack drove the cart through a ford on a small river. They'd been traveling for the better part of 4 hours, and Grace had to admit she was now getting uncomfortable. She was not used to sitting on a hard wooden seat for any length of time. Well, that's it. You're on the Hayes Ranch, Emily said proudly as soon as the wheels reached the far bank. Grace looked around her. There was a huge expanse of prairie to the right-hand side, but on the left was woodland, and small hills rose majestically out of the plains. She initially referred to them as mountains, but Emily insisted they were nothing but hills. There wasn't a single ranch house in sight. Where is the house? In the woods? Grace looked confused, and Emily laughed. We have a good half an hour, or perhaps even a little longer, to ride before we actually reach the ranch house. I don't think anybody has ever taken the trouble to measure the extent of the land on the ranch. My father attempted to work it out once. He guessed it was around 75,000 acres. Grace's eyes grew wide. The letters she received indicated the ranch was large, but for some reason, she had envisioned the area to be around the size of Central Park. To her, that was large. But this was on another scale entirely. Grace had found it impossible not to warm to Emily during the journey. She had praised Brody to the hills and back for the vast majority of the trip. Grace just hoped that when Emily finally got a chance to speak to Brody, she would do exactly the same about her. Jack had also been a delight. He'd been a little gruff to start with. It was probably expected of a cowpoke, as she now knew he liked to be referred to as, who spent the majority of his life around men. When Emily included him in the conversation, he lit up, and slowly, as they traveled all the closer to the ranch house, he opened up. Grace found that he told the most amusing stories. She'd also learned about the cattle drives. They were slowing down now, Emily had said. Due to the price of beef in Montana, ranchers used to drive cattle all the way up there from places like Texas. A good proportion of the cattle on the Hayes Ranch were Texas Longhorns, driven up from previous cattle drives after being purchased by Brody's father. Obviously, the cattle now on the ranch were the descendants of those initially acquired all those years ago. Emily explained that much of the ranch wasn't yet fenced in. Fencing was initially limited to the far side, but the cattle were basically free to graze across the prairie. When cattle drives were run through their ranch land, Brody and the ranch hands were vigilant that none of their own stock was caught up in the herds. That was why he accompanied the cattle drive through the ranch. The Texan ranchers paid Brody to allow their cattle to graze on the land as they passed. It would take 2 full days to drive the cattle through the ranch. Finally, Grace began to see buildings on the horizon. "That's the ranch house there," Emily said, pointing out a whitewashed structure, probably a little larger than Grace expected. It had a large open porch, and she smiled, imagining Brody sitting there, drinking his coffee and watching the sun go down. She thought that maybe one day they might be able to do that together. "That's the bunkhouse there behind," Emily continued. "That's where Jack and the other ranch hands live, apart from the 2 who are married. There are a couple of small houses out towards the back. They live there with their families. There are stables, a blacksmith, and all the usual things you would expect." To be honest, Grace had no idea what to expect. She stared at it all in wonder, and then her mind went back to New York City, and Kate, and Mickey. She knew that this was the perfect place for them. She knew that she would be at home here, despite the strangeness of the surroundings. Grace just prayed that when Brody returned, she would be allowed to stay. Chapter 8. 6 days earlier, New York City Anne had barely sat down when the train blew its whistle, and it slowly started moving out of the Grand Central Depot. Then, after a few seconds, it seemed to lurch forward. There was a grind of the wheels on the track, and Anne pushed herself back against the worn upholstery of the seat. If she looked nervous before the train left, she looked practically petrified now. "Are you okay, Anne?" Grace asked, leaning forward and patting the young woman on the knee. Grace tried to guess the girl's age. She estimated not yet 20. Had Anne told her she was 15, she would not have been surprised. "Oh, yes, thank you, Grace," Anne said, as respectfully as she could. It was almost as if she was addressing her own mother. "It's just that I haven't been out of the city before." "Neither have I," Grace confessed. "Well, I've been to the outskirts twice. Never on a journey anything like this. Never out of state, of course." "So where are you heading?" Anne asked. "Billings, Montana. I'm a widow, you see, and I'm to be married to a man by the name of Brody. He's a rancher." Anne's face lit up with a smile. "Oh, that is wonderful. You'll be on the same journey as me. I'm traveling further along the Northern Pacific Railroad, heading towards Tacoma in the Washington Territory." Grace smiled. Well, at least she would have one companion throughout the entire journey. "So, who are you going to marry?" "Marcus Howard," Anne replied with as much confidence as she could muster. "He's the deputy in Tacoma. He's a little older than me. Not that it matters, of course." There was something in Anne's voice that suggested otherwise to Grace. "How old are you, Anne?" Grace asked. They both paused for a moment to look outside the window as the landscape changed for the first time. The grand buildings of Manhattan had now been left behind and gave way to smaller houses and the occasional patch of green. "Would you mind if I opened the window?" Anne asked, standing up. "I think we will get some fresh air soon. It seems stuffy in this carriage." "Of course not," Grace agreed, noting she had ignored the question. When Anne sat back down and smiled, Grace asked the question again. "So how old are you?" "I'm 18, Anne said, rummaging in her small bag to avoid making eye contact with Grace. "And how old is this deputy?" Grace asked, dreading the worst. "He's 42, Anne said quickly. "But I never thought age mattered in a relationship, did you?" "No, I suppose not. As long as there is love, it doesn't matter." There were plenty of young women in New York married to older men, especially older wealthy men. "So what caused you to head out west? You're a pretty girl." "I would have thought you would have been able to find a husband here in New York," Grace said. Anne immediately flushed, and Grace felt guilty. She realized it was a rather intrusive question. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. Very rude of me. Please accept my apologies, Anne. Personally, I'm heading west because I want a new life. When my Peter died, bless his soul, he left so many memories." Grace's mind flicked back to the tenement apartment. There were so many memories he'd left behind. A small smile played on her lips as she remembered his larger-than-life laugh as it echoed off the thin walls. Despite their financial situation, they enjoyed good times. Of course, some memories were more lifelike than others. "Oh no, it's fine. I didn't think it was rude at all. I just wanted a taste of adventure, I think. My parents," she paused as she considered her words. "They had very real views about women and their place in the world. I knew if I stayed, I'd be forced into a marriage I didn't want. I'd read about mail order brides, and the option just seemed obvious." Unconsciously, Anne placed her hand on her stomach and looked out the window. Grace sensed there was more to the story than Anne was letting on. Her eyes were full of secrets, but now was not the time to press. "Do you think it will be this quiet for the entire journey?" Anne asked. "I guess we'll get more people as we get closer to Chicago," Grace said. "I have no idea how busy the lines will be after that. Let's stick together. You can never be too careful." Grace gave her a knowing nod. "Yes, I'd like that a lot," Anne replied, smiling broadly. "I've been worried about the journey. If I'm to be honest, it doesn't seem so daunting now that I found you." Chapter 9, 6 days later, Montana. "This here is Grace. She'll be staying with us a while, Rebecca," Emily said with a huge smile. "Sure thing, Miss Emily," Rebecca said with a cursory nod. "Pleasure to meet you, Rebecca," Grace said, trying her best to smile though she was absolutely shattered. The 6 day journey, followed by the shock of Emily's confession and then 4 hours on the cart to get to the ranch, had finally taken its toll. "You too, Miss Grace," Rebecca replied with a nod of her head as confirmation. "Rebecca here is our cook and maid. Quite frankly, I don't know what on earth we would do without her. The same is true for all the staff, to be honest." "Can I fix you both something?" Rebecca asked. "Yes, please, Rebecca. I'm sure Grace is absolutely famished," Emily replied. Rebecca gave her another respectful nod while eyeing Grace and then turned to head back to the kitchen. Truth be told, Grace was indeed hungry. She had eaten little on the train as a result of a combination of lack of money, nerves, the jolting of the train, and looking after Anne, all of which had quite an effect on her stomach. However, now she didn't know whether she wanted to eat or sleep. She guessed it would appear rude if she asked to retire to her room straight away. She would have to eat first and hopefully keep her eyes open during the meal. "Let me show you up to your room," Emily said, immediately picking up her carpet bag and suitcase. "I could take that," Grace said, a little bit ashamed that the younger woman was doing the lifting. "It's no bother. I can see you're tired, and understandably so. Let's get a good meal inside of you and then get you to bed. We'll see what tomorrow brings." Grace didn't bother to respond. Emily made the decision, and she followed in her wake. Grace was pleasantly surprised by the interior of the ranch house. Clearly, Rebecca did a fine job of keeping everything orderly. However, Grace was pretty sure that Emily had a strong hand in matters too, what with the abundance of womanly touches around the home. She had feared she would be heading to a bleak wooden cabin with no home comforts. This was at least a pleasant surprise. She followed Emily up the stairs and immediately turned right into a bedroom. Grace gasped at the view out of the window. It was nothing short of spectacular. She could see for miles across the prairie. "Wait till you see your first sunrise out of there," Emily said. "My guess is it'll be better than anything you've seen in New York City." "I don't doubt it for a minute. I'll let you get freshened up. Come down and join me as soon as you're ready." "I'm sure dinner won't be long, and I have to say that Rebecca's food is spectacular." "I won't be long," promised Grace. "Once again, now that we're alone, I have to say that I'm sorry for what I've done. But I promise I will make everything all right with Brody," Emily assured her. "So, when do you expect him to return?" Grace asked. "Sometime tomorrow would be my best guess. Maybe the day after." "Depends on precisely where the cattle drive crossed our land into the neighboring ranch. I doubt he'll want to stay away for too long. He likes to keep a close eye on the place, even though we know that Jack is more than capable." Jack had not come into the ranch house with them. He expressed his pleasure at meeting Grace once more and headed off in the direction of the stables, and no doubt the bunkhouse. As he drove back to the stable, he couldn't resist a little look back, and Grace knew perfectly well it wasn't in her direction. She wondered how far the romance between Emily and Jack had developed. Left alone in her room, she slumped on the bed for a few months. The homestead was absolutely perfect. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to live out the rest of her days here. Of course, she also needed to have her family with her for her life to be complete. And that was conditional on one thing: Brody accepting her on the ranch. She was rather fearful, from what Emily had said, that he would not. After all, if he had wanted a mail-order bride, he would have placed an advertisement for one himself. But now she was here. She intended to make the best of the situation. She might not like Brody, and Brody certainly might not like her. She realized the chance of success was somewhat minimal, but she had to do the best she could. Thankfully, water had been placed in a basin on the side. She took pleasure in luxuriating while washing her hands and face thoroughly for the very first time since leaving New York City. The water was cool and refreshing, and it took her breath away for a few seconds when she splashed it on her face. When she was done, she changed her clothing. She glanced in the mirror in the room and decided that her appearance was acceptable. Tomorrow, she would try to make more of an effort. This would do for tonight, just in case Brody made a surprise appearance. She went downstairs to join Emily, who was sitting in a chair by the fireplace. She leaped to her feet as soon as she saw Grace. "Sit down," Grace insisted. "I'm not anyone special." "That is just where you are wrong, Grace. I gather from your letters that you are someone very special indeed. To have the courage to rebuild your life halfway across the country after the loss of your husband. Well, to me, that is something very special indeed." Grace flushed at the compliment. Rebecca appeared just as the pair were about to sit down and called them through to the dining room. The food was simple but good: chicken, mashed potatoes, and beans. Grace controlled the urge to wolf down the meat as quickly as possible. Back in the tenement in New York, they probably ate meat twice in a month and fish about the same. The rest of the time, it was nothing but vegetables. With each mouthful, she felt her stomach fill and her eyes grow heavier. She asked Emily some questions about the running of the ranch, but didn't really take in the younger woman's answers. Finally, once the meal was finished, Emily apologized again for her actions. Grace disappeared to bed. She changed into her nightdress and prayed that God would see fit to let Brody fall in love with her. She knew it was asking a lot. Grace climbed into a freshly made-up bed for the first time in days. She savored the feel of the mattress, which was far thicker than that she and Kate shared back in New York City. Within moments, she was asleep. She wasn't sure what woke her, but when her eyes opened, the room was still pitch dark. She hadn't drawn the curtains, and she saw millions of stars in the sky. She could see far more than she could in New York, and wondered why for a few moments. She had a burning thirst and decided to go in search of a drink of water. She made her way down the stairs and through the dining room where she had sat with Emily a few hours earlier. She wanted to find the kitchen, but she went wrong twice before finally finding her way. Thankfully, the moon was full that night, and it bathed the kitchen in soft light. She was glad to find a pitcher of water on the sideboard. She started looking for a glass or a mug when she felt the touch of something cold on the back of her head. She then heard a solid click as someone cocked a gun. "Stand perfectly still and tell me what on earth you are doing in my house," a deep voice demanded. Grace froze in fear. Brody Hayes had returned. Chapter 10. 4 days earlier, La Crosse, Wisconsin. Grace looked out over the Mississippi River in wonder. She'd obviously seen the Hudson close up, but the Mississippi with its dramatic backdrop of landscape was nothing short of spectacular. Anne appeared at her shoulder, looking decidedly green. "Are you okay?" Grace asked. Anne took a deep breath and then nodded but said nothing. Then, without warning, she turned and almost ran back the way she came. This was the second time she'd been ill during the journey. The first time was as they were drawing closer to Chicago, some 22 hours since they had left New York City. They had been dozing in their seats as best they could during the night, but as soon the morning came and Anne was awake, the sickness hit her. Now, a day later, the same was happening again. "Is the poor girl unwell?" an older female voice asked, appearing next to Grace. "Yes, I'm afraid so, Caroline," Grace answered. Caroline was a new traveling companion. She joined the train in Chicago and was to be a mail order bride as well. She was older than the other women and hadn't offered her age. Neither Grace nor Anne had thought it appropriate to ask. Caroline greeted the two women enthusiastically, thrilled that she had someone else in her exact situation. "This will be my fourth husband," Caroline said almost matter-of-factly as she introduced herself and the reasons for her journey towards the Pacific. "Fourth?" Anne couldn't help but exclaim in shock. "Yes, I'm afraid I'm a widow 3 times over," Caroline said. "That must be terrible," Grace declared. "Heartbreaking," agreed Caroline, but left it at that. The truth was, she was not sorry about the deaths of any of her late husbands. She had been forced to marry her father's business associate at the age of 17 as a means to pay off one of her father's debts. The man was almost 40. She suffered 2 devastating miscarriages without an ounce of sympathy from her husband. He died of what the doctor called heart complications. She believed he basically drank and ate himself to death. Her second husband had charmed her. He wined and dined her and told her the things she wanted to hear. But he had only been after her money. As a widow, she had actually been well provided for in her first husband's will. The charmer was also a gambler and soon went through her entire legacy. Without money, he left her. 3 months later, she received a letter to say he had died in an accident in Boston. How he got there, she didn't know. He left her nothing. Left on the breadline, she was forced to marry again for security. She thought she had chosen well this time. A lawyer who was a partner in an up-and-coming firm. He was a widower and a few years older than her. Everything went well in the marriage for 3 years, apart from the fact that she didn't conceive. Her husband grew successful as the firm grew. Then he started philandering and turned into a wife-beater. She would learn to dread hearing the key turn in the lock. They pulled him out of the Hudson and declared his an accidental drowning. But Caroline was convinced one of his mistress's husbands had found out and had done away with him. Once more, she was free, and she decided on a new approach for her future. She would head out west. Her argument was that it couldn't turn out worse than any of her other marriages. She kept to herself the fact she had a decent sum to her name. Her future husband would never know if she didn't want to tell him. Caroline didn't even travel first class to hide the fact she had money. "I suspect it'll be the jolting of the train carriage," Caroline said, stretching. "It is not the most comfortable of journeys, is it?" Her back cracked loudly as if to prove the point. "No, I suppose not," Grace said. "Well, we had best get back on the train. No doubt it will be departing soon," Caroline said, turning and heading back to the train. Grace watched her go. She was so very prim and proper. Grace wondered what on earth might have possessed her to consider becoming a mail-order bride and heading out west. She seemed the most unnatural fit for this sort of adventure. Instead of following Caroline, she waited for Anne. Anne emerged a few minutes later, looking better than before. Her face was no longer a shade of green. "Do you feel better now?" Grace asked. "Yes, much. I must have eaten something bad before boarding the train in New York," Anne said, looking genuinely confused. Grace considered Caroline's suggestion about the jolting of the carriage. It was a possibility, of course. She remembered reading somewhere that people suffer on long train journeys just as they do from seasickness on a boat. "Do you need to eat anything now before we board?" Grace asked. "Oh no, I'm fine, Grace, thank you. I genuinely don't think I could stomach it," Anne said wisely. "Yes, probably for the best," Grace agreed. "We best get back on the train. It won't wait for us." "Another step closer to our future husbands," Anne said with a huge smile. Yes, one step closer. But Grace wasn't really concentrating on the conversation. Neither of the potential scenarios for Anne's sickness seemed very likely to her. If Anne had eaten something bad in New York, surely the nausea would be surfacing more frequently. The same would be true if it was brought on by the jolting of the train carriage. Caroline was correct. It truly wasn't a very comfortable journey, and the passengers were continually lurched. Grace was beginning to think that Anne's sickness was due to another reason altogether. Chapter 11, 5 days later, Montana. "Brody, put the gun down," Emily said as calmly as she could. Brody turned to his sister emerging from the darkness. He couldn't help but look behind her in case somebody was holding a gun to her head, and it was all a ruse to disarm him. "Who is this?" Brody demanded, keeping his arm perfectly rigid. "This is Grace." "Put the gun down, Brody," Emily said, taking a step forward and literally pushing down on her brother's arm. After some initial resistance, his arm relaxed and he allowed Emily to push it down. Grace's heart was beating so intensely that she thought it might burst right out of her chest. "Are you okay, Grace?" Emily asked. In truth, she wasn't, but for some reason she suddenly realized the importance of this moment. "I'm fine, Emily. Takes more than that to shake me," she lied as smoothly as possible. She hoped that the trembling in her voice wasn't noticeable. Brody now turned to study her, and Grace did her best to do the same to him without it appearing noticeable. He was tall and his skin was dark, clearly from years of working outdoors. It almost had a leathery texture to it. She couldn't tell the color of his eyes in this light, but she guessed they were dark and almost certainly hazelnut. Then he turned and smiled at his sister, flashing a brilliant set of white teeth. There was little doubt in Grace's mind that Brody was a very handsome man. "Grace? Who is Grace? We don't have guests," Brody said. He turned to Grace. "My apologies to you, ma'am, of course." He tipped his hat at her. "I've told you about wearing that hat in the house," Emily chastised her brother. "It's not going to keep the weather off your head inside here. Take it off." Immediately, Brody took it off and held it close to his chest so that it formed almost a barrier between himself and Grace. "Well, today we've got a guest, and her name is Grace. Why don't you come to the dining room and I'll tell you all about it and why she's here?" Emily suggested, and for the first time, the confidence dropped out of her voice. Suddenly, Grace realized that she was standing in front of her hopefully future husband in nothing more than her nightdress. She suddenly felt very exposed despite Emily's presence. "Okay, sounds like it's going to be an interesting story, Emily," Brody said. "My apologies again, ma'am. Pleasure to meet you. I'm Brody, by the way, Emily's brother." "Yes, I know. Emily has certainly told me all about you. It is a pleasure to meet you as well." Grace nodded and suddenly rather wished she was somewhere else. "Why don't you catch up on that sleep, Grace?" Emily suggested. I'm just going to explain to Brody." Her voice trailed off and she made her exit. Grace didn't respond. She simply grabbed the pitcher of water and took it upstairs with her. She knew that there was a glass in her bedroom. She would fill it up there. Once she was safely in her room, with the door shut firmly, she filled the tumbler with trembling hands. She had never been so close to a gun before in all her life. She would gladly never be this close to one again. But there was one thing that she was certain of. Brody was the sort of man she would need out here. He was a man who would defend her and her family if needed. Emily's letters were correct, and she could not deny that he was handsome. When he tipped his hat, she was almost sure that her stomach flipped in excitement. But that would be stupid, she realized. It would mean she was acting like a stupid child who was infatuated with a man for the first time. And she had to remind herself that this was not her first time and that she was a widow. Guilt overwhelmed her after her first reaction to Brody. Did she not have any loyalty to Peter? Her legs started shaking. She realized it was probably just nerves after the threat of the gun. After drinking her fill of water, she climbed back into bed. She looked out the window. The stars were there in all their magnificent glory, but she didn't really see them. She could only imagine the conversation that was playing out downstairs. She expected at any time for there to be a rap on the door and for Brody to demand she pack her bags and leave. She did not hear the siblings climb the stairs to retire to bed. Perhaps they never did, because at some point she must have drifted into a deep and blissful sleep. When she opened her eyes, the sun was already high in the sky. She quickly leaped out of bed, feeling embarrassed that she slept in for so long. People on ranches had work to do. They didn't idle the day away in bed. She knew perfectly well that this would not create a favorable impression with Brody. If he were indeed to take on another wife, he would expect her to pull her weight. She washed quickly and dressed. When she made her way downstairs, there was no one around. She spotted Emily through the window, somewhere near the stables. She opened the door to the ranch house and made her way out onto the porch, from where she walked down the steps and headed off in Emily's direction. Emily saw her coming and acknowledged her with a little wave of the hand. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" Emily asked, as if the events of the previous night had never occurred. In fact, for a brief moment, Grace had to pinch herself and recall that she really did have a gun trailed on her by Brody. "Oh, how do you think?" "What did Brody say?" "Well," Emily began, as though she had almost forgotten about the conversation she must have had with Brody. "As you can imagine, he was pretty angry to start with. But I'm sure he'll come around to the idea." "What do you mean by you're sure he'll come around to the idea?" Grace asked. "Does he want me to leave?" "That is why I think he'll come around to the idea. I think he was very impressed by the way you handled that situation last night. Most women, myself included probably, would have screamed the house down. You showed immense bravery and that impressed him. As I say, he was angry. He told me that Mother would be ashamed of my actions. I told him she wouldn't, and it was her last wish that he would remarry. He went silent at that, of course. But I didn't lie, at least not about that. Mother did want him married off. And I rather think he liked you last night, which is why he's made no mention of you leaving whatsoever." "So where is he now?" Grace asked. "Ranch work, somewhere. It doesn't matter if there is a beautiful widow in the house. For a rancher, the ranch work must still be done. But I believe I was right. I know perfectly well he will absolutely adore you once he gets to know you. And tonight at dinner, we must put our plans into place," Emily said cheerfully with a clap of her hands. Emily looked Grace up and down. "We must find you some suitable clothing for work around the ranch, and then I think you might well appreciate a bath." Chapter 12. 4 days earlier, St. Paul, Minnesota. My father would have killed me. I had no choice. I simply had to flee. Anne managed to splutter between heart-wrenching sobs. The train had arrived in St. Paul about half an hour ago. The train that would take them on the final leg of their journey was already in the station, and the three women had claimed their carriage. It wouldn't leave for at least another 2 hours. Caroline was taking the opportunity to take a nap and to get some rest. Grace and Anne had gone for a short walk to enjoy the fresh air. The journey was starting to take its toll on them. They sat down on a grassy bank to enjoy the sun on their faces, and Anne finally made her confession. Grace was not surprised by what she heard. "I'm guessing I'm 4 months along," Anne said. She patted her stomach as she did so. "I've been trying to dress so it doesn't show. It might be 5 months. I don't know." "I guessed as much," Grace said. "Don't feel bad about me, Grace. The father was a handsome older man. He charmed me and promised me the earth, but it turns out he only wanted one thing. We said a vow together in a church. He told me we were as good as married in the eyes of God." She gave a fake laugh, as though she couldn't believe she had been so stupid. Grace grabbed her hand. "I don't feel bad about you at all. I understand completely. I'm just glad that Marcus is open-minded enough to accept you as a pregnant woman," Grace said reassuringly. Anne closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were full of tears. The sobs started then. "Oh, Grace, how did I get myself into this situation? He doesn't know." Grace genuinely gasped in shock. "How are you going to explain it? What happens if he rejects you?" Anne immediately turned red. "I don't know. My plan was simple. Pass the child off as his. When I was hardly showing at all, I thought it would work. And you know how naive men are about these matters, especially out west. My plan was to say the baby had come early." Grace shook her head, contemplating the story. "You promised you wouldn't feel bad about me, Grace," Anne said. "I don't. I really don't," Grace replied. She couldn't really, considering everything. "Let me tell you the whole story," Anne said. "I had a very strict upbringing. My parents had very firm ideas about who I would marry, and I knew the candidates would not be to my liking. I knew the day I reached my 18th birthday, I would be married, probably to somebody my father believed could be of benefit to him." There was more than a hint of anger in Anne's voice. "You said you were 18, Grace said, suddenly realizing that her initial suspicion had probably been correct. She sighed. "I just turned 17 the day before we left New York," Anne said, once again turning red with shame at the lies she had already told. Grace reached out and patted Anne's hand. It doesn't matter. Go on. Continue with the rest of the story. As I said, I knew I would be married off. They started talking about it during my 14th birthday party. My father said that my pretty face would attract many men. He was right. William, the baby's father, was 25, a young business associate of my father's. He wasn't successful enough for my father to consider allowing me to marry him, of course. But I saw him at various social functions. I then began sneaking out of the house to meet him. My parents never knew, of course. One thing led to another. The promises he made, anyway. Anne hung her head, not wanting to discuss it any further. It was then that the sobs really started. My father would have killed me. I had no choice. I simply had to flee. William obviously didn't offer to do the decent thing, Grace asked. Anne shook her head. As soon as I told him my suspicions, he disappeared out of the city, gone like a thief in the night. Disgusting to take advantage of a poor young girl like you and then disappear. It makes me sick to my stomach, Grace said. She couldn't help thinking about her landlord back home. She had little doubt that some of the young babies in their tenement in New York City were his. She feared a little for Kate, but prayed that before long her sister would be heading west to join her. I've committed a terrible sin, Grace. I'm going to commit another one when I get to my destination and I don't tell Marcus. Grace didn't know what to say. Instead, she clutched Anne's hand in a reassuring manner. She was hardly in the position to offer judgment. It was amazing what women had to do to survive against the harsh realities of the world. But that's not the worst of it, of course, Anne said, turning to Grace. There's more? I'm afraid so. Think about it for a moment. By the time I realized I was pregnant and William had made his hasty retreat, there was no time to start a correspondence with anybody out west. Grace realized that was true. The length of time it took for letters to pass back and forth between the frontier territories meant there was no way Anne could be on this train today as a result of a promise of marriage. Of course. So how are you here with a new husband at the end of the line? It was my cousin who was corresponding with Marcus. I knew all about it. It was a big secret. She was planning to run away when he proposed. I used to collect her from the post office mail for her so that her parents wouldn't know. One of my duties for my father was collecting his business correspondence and the like, so it was usual for me to collect the mail. Anyway, a letter came from Marcus for my cousin, and I suddenly hit upon an idea. I would go out west in my cousin's place and marry Marcus. I knew that she was waiting for a proposal. I opened the letter carefully without breaking the seal, and as luck would have it, he had sent an offer of proposal. So I committed yet another unspeakable act. I wrote a letter to my cousin as Marcus. His handwriting was easy to mimic. He clearly doesn't have much education, and he forms his letters very squarely. As Marcus, I told my cousin that Marcus had been corresponding with another woman and had offered her a proposal instead. I wished her well in the future. I carefully put it in the envelope, glued it back down, and gave it to my cousin. She thinks that Marcus has broken off the romance, and here I am, heading west in her stead. When I arrive, I will be Charlotte, and I'll be 26. The age gap between Marcus and Charlotte didn't seem as wide now, but Grace's eyes widened as the magnitude of Anne's deceit became clear. You'll never pass as 25, Anne, Grace said. Won't I? I have a bag full of makeup here. I haven't bothered wearing any on the train, of course, but just before we disembark, I'll put it on. Will he really care? From my experience with men, they won't. Had I stayed, I honestly believe my father would have killed me. I had little choice. Grace sat in silence for a while. She hated lies, but knew perfectly well she was not an innocent. Anne was just doing what was best for her and her unborn child, just like Grace was doing for her own family. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Chapter 13. 4 days later, Montana. Montana is a beautiful place, isn't it? Brody commented in his deep voice. Grace quickly turned to see Brody walking up the steps onto the porch. He tipped his hat when she looked in his direction. She hadn't noticed him arrive. He must have walked around from the rear of the ranch house on the far side. She was sitting in a rocking chair, admiring the view which she honestly believed it would be impossible to tire of. She'd had a good day with Emily. The younger woman had found her suitable clothing, more appropriate for a day out on the ranch, a skirt that went down to her ankles. It was made of denim, Emily explained. Grace had never heard of it. 2 cotton blouses with long sleeves that buttoned at the wrist. She gave her a battered, old, wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the harsh elements. Finally, a pair of suitable boots and leather work gloves to match. Somehow it all seemed to magically fit. Then she taught her to tie a neckerchief to protect her face from the dust and sun. After she had changed her attire, Grace looked like quite the experienced rancher. Emily then introduced her to the horses. That was somewhat entertaining. Grace's only experience with horses of any kind was with those who pulled carts and carriages in the New York streets. She had never actually stroked one until today. It had taken every inch of courage in her to do so. Emily suggested that maybe Brody could teach her to ride. One way or the other, horses are the only form of transport around here after all, Emily said, having told her how she had been riding horses like a man since she was 6 years old. She could teach Grace if need be, of course, but it could be a good way for her to spend time with Brody. Grace didn't know whether to be excited or fearful at the prospect of learning to ride a horse. It wasn't something that she had genuinely considered, but the thought of Brody teaching her brought a few shivers of excitement down her spine. She agreed with Emily that it would be a good idea. Emily had given her a tour of the homestead. She said hello to some of the other cowpokes who all proved very respectful after Emily simply introduced her as her guest. Not one single person inquired as to why she was there. Then, just as Emily promised earlier, Grace enjoyed a soak in the huge tin bath that was pulled out into the wash house for her use at the rear of the house. Rebecca brought buckets of warm water from the stove, and Grace luxuriated as the dirt and grime from the journey washed off of her body. Now she was dressed for dinner. The nerves once more kicked in because she knew that Brody would obviously be present. It had been hanging over her head the entire day. Emily had offered repeated assurances that Brody would warm to the idea of marriage. However, Grace wasn't too sure. The man must have been terribly shocked to find a woman in a nightdress walking around his house at night. His reaction with a gun was nothing short of understandable, but she did hold some hope. Surely, if Brody wanted her out, he would have instructed her to leave. He may have allowed her to stay until morning, but then he would have told her to go. But she was still here. Grace was now waiting for Emily, tired after the day's events, and enjoying a peaceful moment, taking in the view when Brody had caught her unawares. Grace quickly got to her feet. "The views are way better than New York, I'll grant you that, Mr. Hayes." Brody gave her a small smile. "Listen, you have to call me Brody. Whenever you say Mr. Hayes, I expect my father to show up." "Brody it is. Of course, you must call me Grace," she muttered, feeling strangely relaxed in the man's presence. "I must apologize for the situation. I know you came here expecting to find a man to marry. But as you obviously know by now, you were deceived." Grace felt it as a kick to the stomach for more than one reason. "Emily was clearly doing what she thought was best for you." Brody laughed. "Emily is full of ideas of what is best for me." "Sisters do that," Grace said, thinking of Kate back in New York. "I read the letters you sent to Emily, or rather to me last night," Brody said softly. "Please sit back down, this seems very formal." Grace did exactly as she was told, and Brody took a seat next to her. They were beautiful letters. "Obviously, I only saw one side of the correspondence, but you must be very brave to leave your sister and travel here all alone, and her boy Mickey. I'm not sure I would have that courage, not knowing what might await me at the end of the journey." "Thank you," Grace said, rather unsure of what to add and not keen to get onto the subject of the family she had left behind. Brody seemed to be in the mood to talk, so she let him. "I have to say you are far too modest in your letters. You are a beautiful woman, Grace." Brody's words made her face flush. She had not been expecting compliments today. Her marching orders, yes, but certainly not this. Brody continued talking. "But I'm a widower. I was madly in love with Sarah." We made so many plans to be together for the rest of our lives. I was going to build this ranch to be the biggest and best in Montana. My father truly didn't think I could do it, and I wanted to show him. I wanted Sarah there at my side, bringing up our family. Of course, life is cruel, as you no doubt know. I'm sorry to hear about your husband. Just as I was sorry to hear about Sarah, it seems that life doesn't spare anyone from a share of tragedy, Grace reasoned. Brody nodded his head wisely. That is very much true, Grace. After Sarah's death, I vowed that I would never marry again. I simply put all of my energy into the ranch. We are not the biggest in Montana yet, but I am sure I've achieved far more than my father ever believed I could, and that really does give me some satisfaction. Grace sensed there was a hidden resentment in his relationship with his long-dead father, but now was not the time to pry. I wasn't sure what I expected when I came. The ranch is nothing short of spectacular. Oh, you've only seen a fraction of it. I'll take you to see some of the more beautiful sections. Grace couldn't help but gasp. Not at the suggestion that there was even more beauty to be seen, but at Brody's implication. So what does that mean, Brody? Are you not sending me back to New York City? Brody sighed. I make no promises, Grace, but Emily was right. It is time for me to consider taking a wife. As I say, you are a most beautiful woman, and you're here looking for a husband. I would suggest you stay on at the ranch, and we see how things go. Of course, if you don't feel that is too improper. She felt a huge wave of relief come over her. There was a chance for love. Seeing as Emily lives here too, I don't think it the least bit improper. I'm grateful to you, Brody. He laughed. No, it is I who is grateful to you, Grace. After all the lies and deceit to which you've been subjected, I'm surprised you will even consider staying. Grace closed her eyes for a second and took a deep breath. The words were somewhat of a kicker. She opened her eyes and said, as I said, Emily was only doing what she thought was best for her family. No one can blame her for that. Brody nodded. Of course, people would do anything for their family. Grace hoped that he remembered that because there was more she would have to tell him. Chapter 14. 3 days ago, approaching Staples, Minnesota. And that is how I managed to get the man off of the bank robbery charges, despite the fact that he had in excess of $2,000 in his trouser pockets, Percival Settle said with a hearty laugh. The three women chuckled along politely, but Grace was now at the point where she rather wished he would stop telling stories of his seemingly infinite courtroom victories. She just wanted a little peace and quiet in order to reflect. Grace guessed he was in his early to mid-60s. He had brilliant white hair with a beard to match. Dressed as he was in a three-piece suit with a bright red tie, he certainly made an impression. He had joined the carriage a few minutes before the train was to leave St. Paul. Ladies, if I may join you, there appears to be nowhere else on the train for me to make my journey. You have nothing to fear from an elderly lawyer, he said, climbing up without waiting for an answer. The women all made welcoming noises. An additional traveling companion might make the journey more entertaining, they all thought. During the course of the journey, the three women had covered almost every topic of conversation. Caroline wasn't, of course, aware of Anne's situation. That was a private matter between her and Grace. Although as much as she despised the deceit, Grace couldn't help but admire the young woman's tenacity. It was such an outrageous plan that it might actually work. Caroline spoke little about her future husband, only mentioning that his name was Matthias Hardwick. Grace had a burning curiosity to find out exactly what Matthias did, but she didn't press Caroline. The fact that the woman didn't immediately offer the information suggested that he probably held a position in a lower-paid occupation. The one detail Grace had discovered about Caroline was that she was a little snobbish. Of course, that didn't make sense. She couldn't see Caroline agreeing to marry somebody she considered beneath her. As a 3-time widow, Grace would have assumed she had means, but here she was with them, and not in first class. There was clearly a reason why she was keeping these details a secret. Grace had long decided not to press. So a new traveling companion might be just what the threesome needed to pass the time during the rest of the journey. I'm Percival Settle, the the elderly lawyer introduced after climbing aboard at St. Paul. "And I'm now going to settle in Seattle, which is interesting for a settle." He let out a laugh she would imagine emanating from a bear. Anne laughed at the joke, and Grace joined in. Caroline managed a slight smile. Grace was glad to hear Anne laugh. It had taken some time to calm her down after her confession. She could understand the young woman's angst at running away from home. Her father seemed truly tyrannical by what she had said. Grace couldn't say she altogether approved of her method for escaping his wrath, but here she was. If Anne had an opportunity for a better life out west, she should take every chance she had and grab it with both hands. She hoped for her sake that everything worked out. But she had a nagging feeling that problems might arise. She couldn't take the weight of the world on her own shoulders. She was heading west to marry a man she had never met. What would happen if he turned out to be different from the description provided in the letters? Grayson noticed that Percival seemed relatively jumpy after he settled into their carriage. Not a minute after sitting down, he was on his feet and peering down the platform. "Shouldn't this train have departed by now?" he demanded, pulling a silver fob watch from his chest pocket and studying it closely, screwing up his eyes to see the hands. "If there's one thing we've learned on this journey, it's that trains are never on time," he said. Nodding his head, Percival sat back down. "You must call me Percival, my dear. Now tell me your names." They did just that. Percival explained how he had an opportunity to join a growing practice in Seattle. Despite his age, he rather fancied a change of scenery, but he didn't seem entirely comfortable until the train started moving. Then he seemed to relax and settled back into his chair. Grace began to think that the jovial lawyer was running away from something, or more likely, someone. "Tell me, Percival," Anne asked after he finished telling his story about the bank robbers. "What is the one thing you've learned about people in your years of being a lawyer?" Grace couldn't help but smile. It seemed like a very mature question for a young woman who had only just turned 17. "That is a simple one, my dear Anne," Percival said, clapping his hands together. He then lowered his voice and leaned forward in his chair as though gathering the travelers in the compartment into a conspiracy of some kind. "Without a shadow of a doubt, the one thing I've learned about human beings is that we all have secrets to keep." Grace sensed Caroline tense at the words. She snuck a glance and saw she had paled decidedly as though Percival had somehow found out about her secret. Grace flicked her eyes back to the old lawyer. He looked at Grace and nodded his head. Everyone. Grace couldn't believe how right he was. Chapter 15. 4 days later, Montana. "I can tell immediately that he likes you," Emily said over the breakfast table that morning. The dinner following Grace and Brody's conversation on the porch had gone wonderfully well. Grace and Brody had made polite small talk, encouraged by Emily. He asked about Kate and Mickey. Grace focused her responses more on Kate than the boy. She explained how hard Kate worked and how well she cared for the child. She was initially trying to convey that Kate was a very hard worker. Since her arrival on the ranch, she had seen the cowpokes rushing around in the distance. She saw men constantly leaving and arriving on horses. She knew perfectly well that the ranch needed many hands for it to run smoothly. Maybe the ranch was missing certain skills that women could perhaps provide. She imagined that clothing must be damaged on an almost daily basis. Rebecca seemed to have her hands full, looking after the ranch house, and it wouldn't seem appropriate for Emily to be darning the cowpokes' clothing, but Kate certainly could. It was a trivial example, but when the time came to ask if Kate could move to the ranch, she wanted to be able to illustrate her potential value. She asked him about life on the ranch. He explained it all in vivid detail. She was lost on many of the points, but she nodded at what she believed to be the appropriate moments. It was only when Emily interrupted and suggested that ranch talk might be a little boring for Grace that the subject was changed. "For my part, I found him just as you described in the letters," Grace replied to Emily's statement. "Yes, look, I'm sorry," Emily began. Grace held up her hand to stop her. "I wasn't mentioning it to get an apology, Emily." I was in fact saying you described your brother perfectly. Thank you. Emily appeared thoughtful before adding, well, somebody has to. Otherwise, he would have been here alone for the rest of his life. What about you, Emily? Are you thinking about getting married? Grace asked, thinking about the way she and Jack looked at each other on the journey from the train station. Oh, no doubt it will happen at some point. I'm in no rush, Emily said quickly before changing the subject. How are you finding the food? The breakfast that Rebecca had prepared was hearty. It was fit to fill the stomach, ready for a full day's work. It's wonderful, just like last night. Rebecca is an excellent cook. What are they eating in the bunkhouse? Grace asked. Cowboy food for the most part. Simple fare, bacon, biscuits. I can tell you now there's nothing like Jack's rice and beans, Emily said. Grace studied her closely. There was a little glint in her eye, as though she was remembering enjoying a meal of rice and beans with Jack over a campfire sometime in the past. So what do you have planned for me today? Grace asked, pushing her plate away. Emily looked shocked. Work? I don't have anything planned for you as yet. You're a guest. Emily, if I'm to prove that I'm worthy of pulling my weight around here, I need to do something. Emily nodded, conceding that Grace would want to feel as though she was pulling her weight. I'm going to take a look at the chicken coop. Why don't you get yourself acquainted with the horses again? There's nothing like being confident around the animals. They are essentially our lifeblood. Without them, ranching work would fail instantly. Then, once I'm finished with the chickens, I'll show you the delights of mucking out a stable. The prospect didn't sound exactly appealing, but Grace realized that this was the work she would soon have to become accustomed to. Besides, it would certainly be preferable to working in the factory. They left the table, and Grace felt guilty that she hadn't tidied up. Prosody. Rebecca will do all that, Emily said, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder as Grace made to clear the plates. Grace nodded and put them back down, but it didn't banish the guilt. She had never had anyone fetch and carry for her in the past, but she realized this is how the division of labor must be. Emily took a basket and headed over to the chicken coop. Grace pulled on her boots, put on her leather gloves, and headed out to the horses in the stable. There weren't many horses in the stables, and she guessed that most of the ranch horses would currently be ridden by the ranch hands. She looked at the first horse and decided he was far too big to approach. She almost had to crane her neck to look up at him. She moved further into the stables and found what she guessed to be a slightly built mare. She stood and smiled at the horse for a moment, as if trying to judge its temperament. Then, step by step, she began to move forward. She gently held out her hand over the rail and allowed the horse to nuzzle it. The mare made sounds as if comforted by Grace's actions, and she couldn't help but smile. That was very good. People often move too quickly around horses, I find, a voice came from behind her. Grace immediately dropped her hand and turned. Brody was standing at the door to the stables. Grace suddenly realized that the man had a strange habit of being able to appear almost unannounced at any given moment. He must walk stealthily, almost like a wolf in the night. You gave me a scare, Brody, Grace said with a welcoming smile. My apologies, not my intention, but I thought it might be interesting to see how you handle the horses. I guess you don't have much experience with these sorts of animals? I hadn't touched one in my life until yesterday. I've taken the occasional carriage ride in New York City, but nothing other than that, Grace said. Emily tells me that you would like to learn to ride, Brody said, almost teasingly. Grace laughed. Yes, I have to say it was Emily's suggestion, but it makes sense, considering the horses tend to be the only form of transport around here. That and good old-fashioned feet, of course. Nothing wrong with those, Brody replied. But the ranch is too big to walk everywhere. We'd never get anything done. That mare doesn't have a rider at the moment. She might be ideal for you to learn on. Let's get her saddled up, shall we? Brody said, turning to take hold of a saddle hanging against the stable wall. What? Now? Grace said, a little shocked. Brody couldn't help but laugh. There's no time like the present, in my view, unless you are scared, but I don't see a woman who can stand calmly with a gun in her hand, being scared by a little horse. Grace knew that Brody was playfully taunting her. He was right. There was no way on earth she was going to show any sign of fear when it came to horse riding. "What do I do?" Grace demanded. "I'll show you." Brody proved to be an excellent teacher. Less than an hour after mounting the saddle, she found herself gently trotting around the yard. The look of delight on her face was evident. Brody smiled at the obvious joy on her face. It had been a long time since he had smiled at any woman other than his sister. As he realized this, he felt a pang of guilt strike him deep in the heart. Sarah. He was betraying the memory of his poor young dead wife, and he had vowed never to do that. He became distracted, and he didn't notice Grace's excitement. With the thrill of her first ride, Grace nudged her heels a little too hard in the horse's flanks. The mare raced forward, sprinting around the yard in a hasty circle. When the beast finally slowed to a halt in response to Grace tightening the reins, such was her relief that she slid out of the saddle and onto the ground. Brody was there in an instant. "Are you okay, Grace? Everything all right?" he shouted, running and almost sliding into her as he dropped to his knees. He half expected her to have broken an arm or a leg, maybe worse, but when she raised her head from the dirt, he was shocked to see that she was laughing. "Don't worry, I'm fine." She threw her head back and looked up at the sky, her expression one of delight. That was amazing. Chapter 16. When she climbed into bed that evening, Grace's entire body ached. Her back, her legs, and her shoulders all screamed. But it didn't matter. It had been a wonderful day. The horse riding, swiftly followed by mucking out the stables with Emily, had taken its toll. She wasn't afraid of hard work. The hours spent in the factory in New York confirmed that. But this was somehow entirely different. Her body was being challenged in so many ways. The way Brody looked down on her when he thought she'd been injured after falling from the horse, that was something she hadn't experienced before. Peter had never looked at her in that way. That one look told Grace that there was something between her and Brody. Yet, at the same time, she sensed a certain reluctance within him. This was understandable. It was early days, but there was a worry that it was something more. Brody confessed over dinner that evening. "When I first found you in the kitchen, Grace, I wasn't overly surprised." "What do you mean?" Grace asked. "I had a sense that Emily was up to something. It's her nature." "Brody, that's not fair to say," Emily objected. "It's not. It's perfectly true, and you know it," Brody cajoled his sister. Grace enjoyed seeing the way the relationship between the siblings worked. It was jovial, and Brody very much treated Emily as an equal. "You thought you were being subtle, but for the past few months, you've been dropping all sorts of hints about wives, marriage, and child prodigies to carry on the ranch." Grace felt Brody tense at the final statement. She sensed that children were something Brody wanted above all else, to be the lifeblood and the future of all he had built up with that which his father had passed to him. Emily gave her brother a sideways glance. "But you didn't really understand what was happening," Emily said. "If you did, you would have said something." Brody grinned again. "Not fully, Emily, but I had my suspicions almost confirmed when I went into the post office about a month ago. Old Hank in there asked me who I knew in New York to be receiving so many letters from back east. He seemed confused when I said I knew nothing about any letters from New York. He just gave me a huge wink as though I was involved in some kind of a conspiracy. There had been no shortage of mail-order brides coming to Billings. Hank had seen it all before. I started putting two and two together back then." This time it was Emily's turn to blush. "So you knew all along? Why didn't you stop me?" Brody put down his fork. "Because I trusted you. Because I wouldn't have got round to doing it myself." Emily smiled with almost maternal affection at her brother. "Thank you." "If you were expecting me, why did you have a gun to my head?" Grace asked. "Wouldn't saying howdy be a little more appropriate?" She spoke in a light tone, but the confusion was certain. "But you could have been anybody, Grace. Trust me, out here there are bandits, robbers, horse thieves, and rustlers aplenty. Many of them have women among their number. Emily can use a gun. If you're to stay, it'll probably be best if we teach you how to use one as well." Grace felt a jolt through her stomach. She wasn't sure if it was the prospect of bandits learning how to use a firearm or the fact that Brody had suggested she was staying. She lay in bed with an aching body and smiled at the thought that Brody knew what Emily had in mind for him. If he truly objected to the idea of a mail-order bride, he would have called his sister out long before Grace arrived. It seemed with every passing hour that things were going to work out. Maybe her grand plan would work, and her mind drifted back to New York City and her old tenement apartment. One face in particular came to mind. The face of the person she was doing this all for. And tears rolled down her face like a waterfall because she dearly missed seeing that face. She knew that before long, she would have to make a confession of her own. Chapter 17. 3 days earlier, Mandan, Dakota Territory. The town of Mandan was how Grace imagined the West, a ramshackle array of wooden buildings, all surrounded by fields of haphazardly pitched tents, wagons, and carts. There was an energy in the air as people went about their business, shouting and calling to others they knew. Goods were being transported to and from the railroad. Grace found it all quite enthralling and could have stood and watched for hours. But their time was up. Now she and Anne were back on the train. The travel companions had decided to take turns disembarking at this latest stop to ensure that someone was always with their belongings. They realized they couldn't be too careful. Grace and Anne had gone for a walk first. On their return, Percival was now escorting Caroline, no doubt telling her a series of stories that could bring her to tears. Grace didn't feel guilty in the slightest. She understood it was Percival's nature to try to keep the women entertained, but she was glad for the break. Some of the stories he told were nothing short of fantastical. For some reason, she wondered if he was a lawyer at all. There was something about him that didn't quite make sense. "You'll be leaving soon. I valued your advice and support," Anne said, leaning forward in her chair and grasping Grace's hand. "I'll miss you. I'll miss you," Grace said, meaning it. Anne's company had been welcome during the journey. Anne sharing her problems meant that Grace almost forgot her own. Almost. Anne fought back the tears and glanced out the window, nervous that Caroline and Percival would make an early appearance. She wanted to ask Grace for further advice. They had only just left, probably only half an hour before. This was a longer stop than usual as the train took on fuel and additional water. "I'm so worried. It seemed like the perfect plan when I was back in the city. But now that I'm here and almost about to arrive, it seems almost ludicrous to think that I could pull it off," Anne said. Grace was unsure how to respond. Anne's assessment was perfectly correct. You did what you had to do. You had to escape your father. What happens next? Well, that's up to you and in the hands of God. What would you do? Would you be truthful? You haven't lied to Brody. Grace felt guilt and shame hit her once more. She was hardly one to preach on this subject. Honestly, only you can decide that. You're pretending to be somebody else, somebody who is older than you truly look. Of course, you are carrying another man's baby. It should be difficult for you to be able to pass this over. Maybe the truth would be the best course of action. But what happens if he rejects me? I have no funds of any significance. You're a pretty girl. You'll make somebody a fine wife. Will he reject you? I don't know. You will have to make some decisions when you get there. I know. I just wish somebody could make the choice for me. Grace squeezed her hand back. Choices are always difficult. You need to work through the problem in your mind. If you can, and if you want my advice, I think honesty is the best policy. But what if he then writes to my cousin Charlotte, explaining what has happened? And what if Charlotte tells my father? He'll know where to find me. Grace closed her eyes and tried to think. It was a horrendous web of lies and deceit that Anne had gotten herself into. She felt for the poor girl. You've just got to believe it will all be okay. You're a resourceful woman. You may be young and inexperienced, but I think you've got the strength and intelligence to adapt to whatever gets thrown in front of you. My advice is simple. If you can, be honest. If you can't, well, you set out knowing that was going to be your course. Live with it and play it out. You have to do what is best for you and your child. Thank you for the wise words, Grace. I wish that I was in your position. You have nothing to be afraid of. Brody knows exactly what he's getting when you step off the train. It must be nice to know that you've got no secrets to hide from him." It was at that moment that Grace almost broke down and cried. But instead, she swallowed back the sobs that were about to break free and simply nodded her head in Anne's direction. Chapter 18, 4 days later. Montana Grace had had another interesting day on the Hayes Ranch. She was hoping for another horse riding lesson, but Brody seemed busy with tasks away from the ranch house. Instead, she spent the day with Emily, immersing herself in more of the jobs she would be doing on the ranch. If, of course, she was staying. Once more, she tackled mucking out the stables. Even after doing it just once, she found it easier, her body already adapting to this daily task. Then she spent a frustrating hour trying to learn how to milk the cows. She managed a pitiful amount in her bucket, marveling at Emily next to her, who kept up a constant flow from the cows she milked. Emily assured her that it was a skill that needed practice and that over time she would get better. Grace proved more successful at churning butter, her factory work, providing her with the strength and stamina needed for this arduous task. But now, at the end of the day, she was looking forward to another of Rebecca's wonderful meals. She was also excited about seeing Brody. That look he gave her after she'd fallen from the horse had lingered with her the entire day. She was hoping for more time alone with him. There was still the guilt she was experiencing over her feelings for Brody. Over the course of the day, she reconciled that Peter would want her to do this. He would want her to secure a better future for everyone. By the time dinner was to be served by Rebecca, Brody was nowhere to be seen. Emily wasn't concerned in the slightest. Ranch work wasn't predictable, so Grace and Emily ate the steak and mashed potatoes alone. Emily proved to be delightful company, of course, but Grace already missed Brody's reassuring presence at the head of the table. The two women then sat on the porch and drank coffee while they watched the sun slowly set over the prairie. But by the time it grew dark, even Emily was showing signs of concern for Brody. Just before the sun finally sank below the horizon, Emily walked over to the bunkhouse to see if they knew about Brody's whereabouts. She returned 10 minutes later. "Jack says Brody took off sometime around 2 in the afternoon. He was in a bit of a dark mood," Jack said. "I hope he's okay." Concern suddenly hit Grace. The idea of Brody being out there alone worried her. This was only heightened when she heard howls in the distance. "Coyotes," Emily said matter-of-factly, as the sounds were heard daily. "Where do you think he's gone?" Grace asked. Emily shrugged her shoulders. "Who knows? Sometimes Brody needs a little time alone. He'll take a tent and camp on the far side of the ranch for a few days." She hesitated, as if unsure about sharing her thoughts with Grace. "However, if he's in a mood as Jack indicated, my suspicion is he's gone to Sarah's grave." Grace felt an awful shot of jealousy rip through her body. She immediately felt ashamed of herself. How on earth could she be jealous of a long-dead woman? When he needs time to think, he often sits at Sarah's graveside. Emily turned to glance at Grace. It was almost as if she knew what the city woman was thinking. "Don't feel bad. He just thinks better out there. This is all a big step for him. My guess, knowing my brother, is he's making matters right with Sarah." Grace felt more at ease after that statement. After all, Grace had reconciled with Peter on the subject earlier that day. She had accepted that she would, if Brody was willing, remarry and build a new life out here. She knew it was the right thing to do. She hoped that was what Brody was doing. But even if he did, he knew that there was still a huge mountain to climb. "So what do we do?" Grace asked. "We just carry on," Emily said in a confident voice, "and we wait." Chapter 19. Brody heard the coyotes howling in the wind. Their cries cut through the quiet of the night. He glanced in the direction of the sound and then simply pulled his worn blanket a little tighter across his shoulders. The coyotes wouldn't bother him. He knew this land. It was his very being. He had thrown his last log on the fire half an hour ago. It crackled and sent a shower of sparks into the air. He watched them dance. The warmth was dying. Hence the need for the blanket. He would feed the fire no more. He had been sitting here for the better part of 5 hours. In many ways, it felt like 5 minutes. In others, it felt like an eternity. For years, he had been drawn to this place. This small hill with its gentle slope and the stream coursing to its left. This was where Brody came when he needed to think. At the hill's peak stood a simple cairn, the grave of Sarah Hayes. In the years following Sarah's death, he would come here practically daily. Then it drifted to weekly, then monthly. Now it was twice a year. He tilted his head upwards and gazed up at the stars. Everything seemed to change on Earth, but the stars were always the same. It seemed strange somehow. He had been talking to Sarah for hours. He brought her up to date with events on the ranch, how Emily had found her husband, how the cattle drives were still going through the land, and how he missed her. He cried, his tears falling on the weathered stones of the cairn. He told her with the tears still stinging his eyes that he knew perfectly well that their son, who she had been carrying, would have grown up to be a fine young man. But then he explained how lonely he had been, how he now believed it was the right time to start again and build a new future. He explained that there was somebody new. He explained that he hadn't gone out seeking the arrangement, that Emily had taken matters into her own hands, but how she had done it with only good intentions. He told Sarah that she would like Grace. He explained that Grace was a strong woman with a fire inside her just like Sarah. Brody knew that Sarah would respect Grace's courage in traveling across the country to marry a man she had never met. And he explained how her bravery when confronted by Brody pointing a gun to her head was nothing short of remarkable. Sarah didn't answer any of these questions or statements, of course. How could she? Being here close to her, he could feel her presence, feel that her spirit was still alive. Brody closed his eyes, and just for a heartbeat, the impossible happened. He heard her voice echoing in the wind. Have no guilt, Brody. Build a new family. Brody's eyes shot open, his heart racing. He searched the shadows and almost expected to see her standing there in front of him. But of course, all he could see was the dying embers of the fire. Instantaneously, he felt the relief of a huge weight lifting off his shoulders. He stood up, folded the blanket, and let his hand linger on the cairn one last time. Then he turned and walked down the hill to his horse. He mounted, took one last look at the dying embers of the fire, and knew he would never return. Gently nudging the mount into motion, he rode off. Brody was heading home to the promise of a new beginning. Chapter 20. Grace woke with a start, drenched in sweat. Her heart was racing with a sense of impending dread. Brody was lying at the bottom of a ravine. Even at a distance, she could see that he was dead. His horse lay next to him. It was almost as if he had ridden off the cliffside. Why would he do this? Then she calmed as she became accustomed to her surroundings. Slowly, Grace realized it had all been a nightmare. Brody wasn't dead. He was out there being the cowboy that he was. No doubt, he would come home when he was ready, just as Emily had said. Grace hoped that would be sooner rather than later. She glanced out the window. The stars were still brilliant in the sky. Her mind drifted, and she wondered if each one had a name. She had no idea of the time, but there was no sign of dawn anywhere on the horizon. Then she heard a sound downstairs. Steps. Brody, she immediately thought. She leaped out of bed without a thought that she was still in her nightdress, opened her bedroom door, and slipped quietly downstairs. After only a few days, she knew the layout of the building, and it felt like home. On her bare feet, she moved silently. She made her way into the dining room, where she was surprised by 3 men. 3 men who she knew perfectly well had no business confronting her in the ranch house. They weren't cowpokes, she could tell by their hushed tones. Bandits, robbers, horse thieves, cattle rustlers. Weren't those Brody's precise words? One of the men turned, and even in the darkness, Grace could make out his lecherous smile directed at her. My, what on earth do we have here? Get out of my house, Grace said in a commanding tone. Of course, she completely ignored the fact that she was only a guest in the ranch house. They were not to know that. The man took half a pace backward, slightly shocked at being spoken to in such a manner by what he assumed would be a weak woman. But then his 2 friends laughed. Get out of your house? I don't think so, my lady, one of them said. What's here world stealing, then? Gold? Silver? Money? Besides yourself, of course. Steady yourself, the first man said, clearly the leader, holding out an arm to stop the man moving towards Grace. If she's anyone's, then she's mine. I saw her first. My right. But as you say, let's get what we really want first. I said, get out of my house, Grace repeated. She was almost shaking with fear, but she was sure she wasn't going to let these men know as much. My husband is only across at the stables, tending to a mare. He'll be back at any moment. She spoke loudly in an attempt to wake Emily upstairs. Brody had also said that Emily knew how to use a firearm. Knowing Emily's nature, she probably had one hidden under the bed for this very eventuality. She kept glancing nervously towards the stairs. The man followed her gaze, and she did her very best to stop doing it in case she gave away that someone was lying in wait upstairs. We can go upstairs soon enough, pretty lady. The man walked towards her and gently stroked her hair. She knocked his hand away in an instant. He laughed. There ain't no man in the stables. We've just been there. I don't think you've got a husband at all, he said firmly. But my friend here is right. What's worth stealing in this place? Gold? You must have gold. Grace shook her head. She was thankful that she had no idea whatsoever if there was anything of value on the property. Surely Brody and Emily were wise enough to keep any valuables in the bank vault in town. The ranch was too exposed to risk keeping valuables here. Well, I don't believe that for a second, little miss. And before we leave, you are going to tell me, the man growled, dropping his voice to a sinister whisper. Emily stood at the top of the stairs, hearing every word spoken. At first, she was amazed at Grace's courage, but she quickly realized that words alone wouldn't help much. Grace needed more than that. Emily's first instinct was to rush into the bedroom, grab her gun, and confront them. But there were 3 men. Even if she managed to take out one right away, she would still be outnumbered and outgunned. She knew immediately what she had to do. Moving silently, she crept along the landing to Brody's bedroom, entered, and walked straight to the window as quietly as possible. Before disappearing, she turned and lifted Brody's discarded coat from the chair. Even in this situation, walking into the bunkhouse in just a nightdress was probably not a wise idea for her future authority. She pulled on the coat and climbed out of the window and onto the sloping roof which led down to the porch. She got to the edge, turned, and slowly lowered herself down. Her feet didn't reach the bottom, so she released her hold and dropped the final few feet. She landed perfectly, took a few seconds to steady herself, and then turned and ran as quickly as she could to the bunkhouse. She prayed Grace would hold her own in the meantime. Chapter 21. Emily burst into the bunkhouse, completely out of breath. Her eyes were filled with fear and panic. The only thought in her mind was getting help to Grace. A small oil light was still burning in the center of the table in the middle of the large room. Around it, 4 cowpokes were locked together in their nightly card game. Some of these men virtually never slept. Smoke rose from the players, and the aroma of tobacco was heavy in the air. They leaped to their feet as soon as they saw Emily enter, and cards and coins fell to the ground. One glance at her appearance and her demeanor, not to mention the time of night, told them something was wrong. Help, she managed to gasp between long, deep breaths. We need help over at the house. A door opened by the main entrance and Jack emerged, rubbing sleep from his eyes. As a senior ranch hand, he was privileged to have a single room in the bunkhouse. The rest of the men shared dormitories of anywhere between 4 and 8. It was much like any other bunkhouse on any other ranch on the frontier, with a sprawling, open central area where the men would socialize, relax, cook, and sometimes fight. These hardened men lived on top of each other constantly, and with only occasional visits to town to blow off steam, disagreements occurred. Fights solved the men's problems, and then nothing more was said about the issue. Emily, what's wrong? Jack asked. He stood shirtless. His body was taut with muscle and marked by the scars of years of labor. There are thieves in the house, 3 of them at least. They've got Grace, she blurted. Jack nodded, and his expression drew dark and resolved. He immediately started barking out clear orders, rousing the men. In less than a minute, there were men everywhere. Men emerged from rooms, all dressed, and the sound of clicks filled the room as weapons were checked and loaded. In moments, a small army was rallied and ready to take on the thieves. "We move quietly," Jack instructed, now fully dressed, holding up his hand for silence. He scanned the men. "Robert, go and wake the men in the married quarters. Have them stay there and protect their families. We don't know how many rogues are around the place. Nathaniel, you look after Emily at the back." Nathaniel was one of the youngest cowpokes. He was barely more than a boy and had been on the ranch less than 4 months. Emily opened her mouth to object to the thought of being protected. "No arguments, Emily," Jack said quickly, ignoring the fact that she was technically his boss. "You need to be safe, all right?" He gave her a look that suggested there was more to this than her just being the mistress of the ranch. Emily nodded, knowing that this was no time to delay Jack and the men. The group moved out into the darkness of the night. They ran quietly across the yard in the direction of the house, their eyes becoming slowly accustomed to the dark. As they did so, a horse emerged out of the darkness. Jack pointed his weapon in front of him, but then he lowered it, recognizing the familiar shape of the rider and the white streak across the nose of the horse. It was Brody. "What's going on?" he demanded of Jack, but Emily pushed her way to the front, shoving cowpokes out of her way. "Thieves in the house, Brody. They have Grace." He stiffened in the saddle, and the panic that Grace could be taken from him hit like a punch to the stomach. "How many?" "There were 3 of them," Emily replied. "At least that is what I saw." Brody thought for a second. The men waited for him to speak. When he did, his voice was without panic, just a calm, measured tone. "Jack, you come with me inside. Todd and Ben, you come as well. The rest of you silently set up a perimeter around the ranch house. If these men escape, you need to gun them down. Stay well out of sight. I don't want them using Grace as a hostage." "Emily, stay with Nathaniel. Like I said," Jack reiterated, turning to Emily, who was now at his side. She simply nodded her agreement as Nathaniel stepped to her side, where he stood tall and squared his shoulders, holding his shotgun in front of him, almost like a barrier. Todd and Ben were 2 of Brody's longest-serving ranch hands. Just like Jack, he trusted them more than anyone alive. These were the men he knew would do anything to save Grace. Brody dismounted with ease, and his boots hit the earthy ground. He retrieved his firearm and quickly checked it. He spoke hastily to his trusted men in hushed tones, highlighting the details of his plan. The rest of the cowpokes scattered, forming the perimeter around the house as he had ordered. Brody and Jack approached the front door as if they were hunting deer. They moved in the shadows, and their feet made no noise as they moved. Todd and Ben peeled around and made for the kitchen entrance at the rear. When they reached the dining room window, Brody paused and peeked into the house. What he saw made his blood run cold, and then anger hit him. One of the intruders was pawing at Grace, his hand gently stroking her shoulder, trying to pull her nightdress off. His grip tightened on his weapon, and he didn't hesitate any longer. He nodded to Jack, and they burst through the front door. Grace stared back at the leader of the thieves in defiance. She had refused to tell him where the valuables could be found, and he had slapped her across the face twice. She just stared back with harsh eyes, showing no pain. Now, to his shame, he was trying a different approach. His hand, which was initially stroking her hair, now moved down to her neck and shoulders. She slapped it away, her eyes burning with anger, but it immediately returned to tug on her nightdress. 2 of the man's fellow intruders looked on hungrily, eager to feast their eyes on the humiliation of the beautiful woman. A crash followed immediately by another broke the tense silence in the dining room, and a few seconds later, Brody and Jack leaped through the door, weapons raised. From across the room, Ben and Todd were in position, their weapons raised and ready to block the thieves' exit. They charged straight at the man. Grace took 4 steps backward as a fight played out in front of her. She turned and shut her eyes, knowing that something terrible was about to happen. 2 gunshots cracked through the air, followed by an explosion of breaking glass. She prayed that none of her rescuers had been hurt. In a matter of seconds, The thieves had been overpowered and their weapons were taken from them in a show of ruthlessness from the ranchers. "Go to the front door and shout to the rest of the men that it's safe to come in," Brody demanded of Grace. She did exactly as she was told. Suddenly, men descended on the ranch house. They secured the thieves and swept the building in case others were in hiding. In the midst of the chaos that engulfed her, Grace turned to find Brody at her side. "Are you okay, Grace? Did they hurt you?" "You came just in time, I think." She noticed how her heart was racing and her legs were trembling. The adrenaline that had kept her strong in the face of the danger was easing. She suddenly realized how close to danger she had come. Without thinking, she grasped at Brody, curling her fingers around his jacket and pulling him in tight. It was only then that she finally felt safe. Chapter 22. 5 days earlier, Forsyth, Montana. As they made their final stop before Billings, Grace felt a sudden wave of nervousness hit her stomach. She was almost here, almost with Brody. The enormity of the situation, meeting a man she had never met, marriage, a new life in a strange place, and of course the secret that she held, seemed to descend on her all at once. Forsyth was a town that had been built solely to serve the railroad. It was small and almost soulless. They knew that their wait at this siding would be around an hour. Once more they would fill up with fuel and water. Grace had lost track of the number of times her trains had done this on the journey. It was now a familiar procedure. No new passengers were getting on the train, so Grace and Anne decided to stretch their legs and get some air. Caroline decided to stay on board, and Percival was sound asleep, his hat tipped down over his eyes. The two women crept out of the compartment as quietly as they could, so as not to disturb him. There wasn't much to see at all in Forsyth, with its meager scattering of wooden buildings, and nowhere near the number of tents or wagons they'd seen at previous stops along the route. There was very little going on at all. Both women were glad that this was not their final destination. As they walked, their footstep crunching on the gravel platform, their talk turned once more to their impending parting. "I will leave you Brody's address. Please write and tell me how things work out," Grace said with both sadness and hope. "I'll do just that, I promise. I think I've decided I'm going to tell him the truth. As you say, can I really live with the lies and the deceit?" Anne said with determination. Grace nodded, but inside a pang of guilt hit her. Who was she to advise on such matters? "I think you made a wise choice there, Anne. What will be, will be. I just hope he's still agreeable to a marriage." Her hand moved almost unconsciously to rest on her stomach. "As I said before, you're a pretty young woman. You're intelligent. Why wouldn't he? He'd be a fool not to." Anne laughed, but there was worry behind the smile. "Well, I'm not too sure about that. I have a pretty cousin back in the city who isn't pregnant. He could still marry her." She dropped her voice and turned almost bitter. "After all, it isn't every man who would be willing to bring up another's child. Let's be honest with one another. So few actually would." Grace suddenly stopped walking. She turned a deathly shade of pale as the color drained from her face. "Do you really think that's true?" Anne tilted her head, wondering what was wrong with Grace. "Yes, I suppose I do. Why? It seems to have bothered you." And then, to Anne's surprise, Grace began to cry. The facade of courage she had put up throughout the journey crumbled in an instant. Every day, her heart ached for all she left behind in New York City. Now Anne's statement had her worried that it had all been for nothing. "It doesn't matter. I don't know. I'm just being stupid, I guess. Nerves, I suppose. It won't be long now after all this way." Anne wasn't convinced by her friend's attempt to deflect. "Grace, there's more to it than that. I've come to know you over the past days, and I know that you aren't a woman to break down in tears very easily." Grace took a deep breath and dropped her voice so that Anne had to move closer to hear her. "Well, I haven't been altogether truthful with Brody myself." "What on earth do you mean?" Anne asked, suddenly full of concern. "This is the first you've mentioned it to me." Grace shrugged her shoulders and let them fall in defeat. "I had no intention of mentioning it at all until the subject came up." Anne's perfect brow furrowed in confusion. The only subject they had raised was the reluctance of men to raise another's child. Grace didn't have any children of her own. Remember I told you about my sister Kate? Grace continued, trying her best to keep her voice steady. Yes, of course. You've left her back in your tenement building in New York with her son. You're hoping to bring them out west when you get settled. It's a great plan. Anne shook her head as she completely lost track of why Grace was upset. Yes, that's what I've told you. I've mentioned Kate and her son in my letters to Brody. I haven't spoken about bringing them out west, of course. But here's the thing. Kate hasn't got a son at all. What do you mean? She hasn't got a son? Of course she has. Mickey. Mickey isn't Kate's son, Anne. Grace confessed quickly. He's mine and Peter's. This is why I'm heading west. I don't want him growing up in 5 Points in New York with the gangs and the danger. Even if he missed out on all that, all he would have to look forward to is a life of hard labor in factories or on the docks. That wouldn't be the case out west. Suddenly, it all made sense, and Anne's heart sank thinking about the pain Grace must be going through. I'm so sorry. Leaving him must have been heartbreaking. I'm sorry. I never knew how hard it would be. Grace sobbed, and it all could be for nothing. Anne immediately moved forward and hugged her friend. You have nothing to be sorry about. You've been so strong on the journey. A mother has to. A mother has to be strong for her child. But all I can do is hope that Brody is one of those men willing to bring up another man's child. A man who would be willing to look past the lies and deceit that I fed him. Grace, I'm sure he is. He sounds like a wonderful man. And after all, Mickey is old enough to know that Brody isn't his real father. It's not like my situation where I'm trying to pass off, well, you know. Anne didn't want to finish the sentence. The perils of her own situation had been spoken about at length. It was Grace's turn to get her worries off her mind. I can only hope. Grace gathered herself and wiped her eyes. In 5 hours, I'm going to be there. I'll be with Brody. The question is, when will I tell him? You'll know when the time is right. I'm sure he'll be willing to have your son come out to join you. Why wouldn't he if it makes you happy? If he doesn't, I'll have to return to New York. I can't possibly leave Mickey behind. You won't need to, Grace. I'm sure of it, Anne insisted, her voice full of optimism. Grace managed to smile at the young woman. Was she speaking the truth, or was it just the hopeful, naive dreams of a young girl who had barely turned 17, was already with child because of broken promises and lies, but still believed the best in people? She guessed she would find out the truth along the railroad. She prayed Brody was one of the few men they had spoken of. Chapter 23. 5 days later, Montana Grace tossed and turned in bed. Sleep seemed to be elusive. The events of the previous few hours replayed over and over in her mind like a relentless nightmare. Whenever she closed her eyes, the men were there, laughing, toying, and pawing at her. Just as dawn was starting to paint the sky in shades of yellow, orange, and mauve, she gave up on the prospect of further sleep. Instead, she rose, dressed, and went back downstairs. She glanced up at the ceiling of the dining room, at the hole made by one of the bullets fired in the upheaval. The glass, which had shattered in the window, had been swept up, and a board had been quickly nailed in its place until a replacement could be found. There was a cool draft coming from somewhere, and as she walked through the house, she discovered the front door was open, which Grace immediately found unsettling. She quickly looked behind her, fearing men would appear once again out of the shadows in the corners of the room. She approached the open doorway, but instead of thieves and bandits, she found Brody in the rocking chair on the porch, his shotgun lying over his lap. He was watching the sun slowly rise above the tree line. "What are you doing here? You should be asleep," he said, rising to his feet as soon as he noticed her standing there. "I tried. I couldn't. I'm not the only one, though." "You must be exhausted," Grace replied, moving closer to him in order to feel safe. "I'm waiting for the sheriff to arrive. I've sent a few of the boys into town to get him. These men, if I can call them that, will feel the weight of justice, the way it should be." There was tiredness in his face, but his eyes were all-seeing, alert and watchful. Grace nodded her head in agreement. She was glad that Brody and his ranch hands hadn't taken justice into their own hands. The 3 men had been bound and taken to the stables, where they were left under guard until the sheriff arrived. I'm sorry for leaving you and Emily like that, Brody said guiltily. I dread to think what might have happened. Grace felt a cold shiver go up and down her spine as he spoke of the incident. She still had the memory of the clammy hand of the leader of the thieves pawing at her. With an effort, she pushed the thought aside, telling herself that nothing had happened. It wasn't your fault, Brody. It was beyond your control. It doesn't stop the guilt, though. If anything had happened to you, his words trailed off, and he began shaking his head. Where were you? She asked softly, knowing that he had probably gone to some special place of his. Brody indicated the rocking chair and the seat next to it. They both slumped down into their chairs, which creaked softly in response. When Sarah died, I buried her here on the ranch, on the hill over yonder. It's a place I always go to when I need time to think and reflect. I understand. It must be horrible to have lost her so young. It was a tragedy, and one thing I haven't told you is that when she died, she was carrying a child. I was sure it would be a son. I'm so sorry, Brody, I didn't know. Her heart ached for his pain. She had never lost a child, but the pain it must bring was something she couldn't possibly imagine. It's hard to talk about. It was a long time ago. The emotion in his voice was rough, but the pain is still here. He touched his chest gently. Tragedy is one thing we've certainly got in common, Grace said thoughtfully as she recalled the lifeless face of her deceased Peter in her mind's eye. Brody managed a smile as he turned in his chair to face her. Oh, I think we've got far more in common than that, Grace. You've shown nothing short of remarkable courage, considering the circumstances. Thank you. Her face reddened at the compliment. Silence hung between them for a few moments. Then he took a deep breath. Look, Grace, I know you were lied to in order to get you out here by Emily, but if you're willing, I truly would like to marry you. On finally hearing the words she wanted to hear, her emotions gave way and she broke down in tears. The stress of the journey, the shock of the unraveling situation when she arrived, was topped by the terror and fear brought on by the events of a few hours ago. I'm sorry. Isn't that what you want? Brody asked, reaching out and touching her hand gently. Grace clasped his hand and held it tight. Oh no, Brody, it's everything that I wanted. She took a cleansing breath. She knew that now was the moment of truth. It was time to confess everything. But I've been less than honest with you. Brody looked confused. About what? You know I'm a widow, but there's something else. Her heart quickened and she knew this was the moment that would decide everything. She stumbled over her words as she tried to choose the right ones. You can tell me, Grace. You can tell me anything. You know that I live with my sister back in New York and that she had a son. Well, the truth of the matter is, he isn't hers at all. Mickey is mine. My son. Mine and Peter's. I see, Brody said, but then his face dropped and he seemed puzzled once again. I don't see why you lied about that. Why are you here when your son is back in New York? Brody's laughter grew deeper than before. Slow down, Grace. Of course, your sister can come out here. The ranch is huge. There is always room for good people. I promise I will make you happy, and this is a part of that. He paused and considered the options. His voice grew a little more serious. Look, once the sheriff has been and gone, and those thieves are off my land, we will ride into town. We can send a telegram to New York and tell your sister to get on the very first train out west. Do you mean it? Grace asked again, hardly able to believe her good fortune. I mean every single word, Grace, he said slowly as if trying to get her to understand. While we're in town, we may as well go and see the pastor about arranging our wedding. If that is what you want, I don't actually think you agreed. She couldn't hold back her joy any longer. Grace threw herself onto Brody's lap and pulled him into an embrace. Brody, this is just what I wanted, more than I dreamed of. Thank you, thank you. No, Grace, thank you. If you hadn't had the courage to head out west, I would have missed out on this last chance of happiness. Brody held her closer and gently kissed her as the sun rose in front of them. Chapter 24, 6 weeks later, Billings, Montana. Grace heard the train before she saw it. The track at the station where she stood with Brody, Emily, and Jack began to vibrate softly. In the distance, she heard a whistle pierce the air, and before long, they saw a column of steam rising in the distance. In a matter of moments, she saw it. Her heart pounded in her chest with excitement. She would finally see her son again after almost 2 months apart. Those 2 months had felt like an eternity. Despite the thrill of her relationship with Brody and the excitement of building a new life in a strange new world, she missed her son. What mother wouldn't? Just as Brody had promised, they'd sent a telegram to Kate, telling her that all was well and that arrangements should be made for her and Mike to travel out west. Grace explained that they would not have the means to travel, and Brody, without hesitation, arranged for money to be sent to New York. The train was almost 2 hours later than the scheduled arrival time. That was nothing unusual, of course. Trains did not run according to schedule. Times were given purely as a guide. It didn't matter. All but 2 of the ranch hands were in town anyway. 2 remained at the ranch, just in case of problems. The only person it actually mattered to was the pastor. Whereas he would rather spend the afternoon snoozing in a hammock, he had to wait at the church. Grace understandably refused to wed until her sister and her son had arrived. She wanted them there to witness the event. As the massive black engine came into view, its brakes squealing on the iron tracks, Grace felt the breath catch in her throat. Grace started slowly walking along the platform, looking into each carriage in turn. The further she got, the more the nerves seemed to take hold. What if there had been a problem on the journey? What if some misfortune had befallen them? Brody, Emily, and Jack held back. They knew this was a time for Grace to be alone. Then, out of a carriage, a pair of arms carefully lowered a small boy to the platform floor. 2 carpetbags followed, each landing with a resounding thud on the wooden planks. They were soon followed by a woman climbing down. It was clear she was weary after the trip. "Good luck to you, Sarah," Kate Thornton shouted. Grace couldn't hear the reply from inside the carriage, but whatever it was, it made Kate laugh. The boy had been placed on the ground with his back to Grace, and now, hearing footsteps, he turned and saw her. "Mama, Mama!" he cried with pure joy. He broke into a run, his little legs carrying him up the platform. Grace swept him into her arms and covered him with kisses as if trying to make up for those lost weeks. "Not so tight, Mama," Mickey gasped. Sorry," Grace said gently, returning Mickey to the ground and bending down on her haunches. "What do you think of Montana, my darling boy?" "It's a bit big," Mickey said with wide eyes, looking from side to side with childish wonder. "Yes, it is, but it's absolutely wonderful." And then Kate was upon them. The 2 sisters embraced. "Thank you for looking after him," Grace whispered to her sister, trying her best to hold back the tears. "Thank you for calling for us. This is quite something, isn't it?" Kate said, gazing around her. "You wait till you see the ranch, Kate. I've never seen anything like it in my life." Kate's eyes fell on her sister's clothing. "Look at you dressed so fabulously. I rather thought you'd be in some form of cowboy attire by now." Grace laughed. "Well, we have somewhere to be before we head back to the ranch." "Where?" Mickey asked, tugging at his mother's skirts in excitement. "We have to go to church," Grace said, kneeling again to speak to him. Mickey looked a little despondent. After a long journey, cooped up on a train, the last thing he wanted to do was sit through a church service. "Mama is getting married today." It was Mickey's turn to break out into a huge smile. "Aunt Kate told me all about Mr. Brody. I'd like to meet him." "Well, let's go and do that then, shall we?" Grace picked up one of the carpetbags, allowing Kate to carry the other. They walked up the platform to Brody, Emily, and Jack, who stood watching the family reunion with delight. Brody was the first to step forward to greet them. He greeted Kate like a perfect gentleman, and then knelt to shake Mickey's hand as if they were equals. "You must be Mickey. It's such a pleasure to meet you. We've got some exciting plans in store for you when we get back to the ranch." "Horses?" Mickey demanded with glee. "My Aunt Kate said I might be able to ride a horse." "I think that might well be arranged." Emily and Jack introduced themselves, and they all piled onto the back of the cart. The short journey was filled with joyful chatter and cries from Mickey, pointing delights out to everyone. The church was already filled with ranch hands. They all nodded their heads respectfully as Kate and Mickey entered the church and sat down. Emily and Jack joined them before Brody walked to the front from a side aisle. Finally, Emily entered, walking up the aisle on her own. Brody was at the altar to greet her. His eyes never left her as she walked to join the man who would soon be her husband. The pastor began the service, the familiar words flowing from his lips without the need for a book or guide. It was a simple enough affair, finished within 20 minutes. At the end of it, Grace was Brody's wife. Brody gently bent his head and gave his new wife a kiss. The ranch hands couldn't control themselves. They all erupted into a huge crescendo of laughing and cheering. "Stop it. This is a serious matter," Brody scolded, looking at Jack and Emily, but they just cheered along with everyone else. Later that evening, when they were back at the ranch, the newlyweds sat on the porch by themselves. The day's excitement had taken its toll. Kate was absolutely exhausted. It was one thing to head west on one's own, but another to head west accompanied by a small child. She had retired to bed soon after, very nearly falling asleep during the celebration dinner that Rebecca had prepared. Mickey was thrilled with the bedroom that had been prepared for him. Grace put him to bed that night and told him a story about brave cowboys and terrible bandits. He listened with his mouth agape, and when she had finished and tucked him in, she could see that wild spark of adventure in his eyes that Brody and Jack held in theirs. She knew right then that the boy would love this way of life. "Well, we made it," Grace said, extending her hand to Brody. He took it and squeezed it gently. "We did. Mickey seems an absolutely marvelous young man." She nodded her appreciation at his kind words. "What he needs is a man's touch. Kate and I have done our best, but there's nothing a boy needs more than a father to show him the way of things." "I will do my best to make Peter proud," Brody said in a solemn tone. It was a beautiful thing to say, and it brought tears to Grace's eyes. But she said nothing. "Then we must think about trying to arrange a match for Kate. I noticed a lot of the ranch hands were very excited by her arrival," Brody said. "I'm sure Kate isn't the only one we need to arrange a match for. There is someone else first in line." Brody looked confused, and slowly it came to him. "Emily, yes, of course. You're right, she's getting older. I can't keep her tied to me forever. There may be somebody in town who is suitable." "Do you not see what's in front of your eyes, Brody?" Grace said, laughing. "Emily is in love with Jack, has been for years, is my guess." Brody's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Jack? She can't be in love with Jack." "Trust me, she is. But let's not talk about it now. This is our wedding night." Brody opened his mouth to speak again, but then looked at his wife and closed his lips. There would be another time to carry on this discussion. They sat in silence, watching the sunset over the prairie from the porch, and then the first stars start to appear. "Are you happy?" Brody asked. "More than I thought possible," replied Grace. They remained there until the moon rose, content that there were no longer any secrets between them.